Rich had barely clocked out from work when he texted Rôvi to let her know he wouldn't be coming straight over to pick up Karma. He explained he needed to head directly to the airport to get Latham, and asked if Karma could stay with her for an extra couple of hours. Rôvi didn't hesitate, of course she would keep Karma a little longer. She even added a smiley face and a "drive safe." By the time Rich pulled up to the arrivals lane, Latham was already outside with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, looking lighter than Rich had seen him in years. When he climbed into the SUV, he exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for 5 years. After some time of catching up on things, Rich asked, "So let me get this straight. In the Marines, you sign up for 8 years, right? You did 5 active, and now you're on a 4-year reserve contract." Latham nodded. "Yeah, that's how it works." Rich asked, "So does that mean you're basically living as a civilian now?" "Pretty much," Latham said, watching the scenery blur past the window. "I can get a job, get married, live my life. I just have to keep them updated on my address and a few other things. But yeah, I can just be me now." Rich asked, "How does that feel?" Latham smiled, really smiled. "It feels amazing. I can't wait to reconnect with people I lost touch with. Fix some things. Try again with family. And man, I can't thank you enough for talking to your landlord. If I can get an apartment in your building. That's huge." Rich shrugged like it was nothing, but he felt the warmth of it. He said, "As far as work goes, we can always use mechanics at the car dealership. And Rocky said he can help you get something part-time where he's at too. You'll be fine." Latham nodded, grateful. "You've always been there for me." Rich kept his eyes on the road. "Besides all that, how's everything else going with you?" Latham leaned back, still looking out the window. "Everything's going great. And you're not gonna believe this." Rich merged onto another freeway and asked, "What is it?" Latham got excited and said, "Well, you know back in the day I was always TRO." Rich replied, "Unfortunately, yes." Latham laughed under his breath. "Yeah, well, I didn't realize I had a son. Or, I mean, I knew I had kids out there. But me and their moms were never on good terms. Mostly because of me, and they felt it was better if the kids didn't know I existed." Rich didn't interrupt. He just listened. "But somebody told one of my exes that I was in the Marines now. And she reached out. She wanted me to know I have a son. A little guy. A toddler. And he looks just like me." Rich stayed quiet, giving him space. "She named him Latham Jr." Rich couldn't help the smile that spread across his face. He flicked on his blinker and merged into the passing lane. Traffic thickened until the SUV eased into a full standstill. Latham glanced at the long line of brake lights glowing ahead of them, recognizing the rare moment of stillness. It felt like the safest window to finally show Rich the photos he'd been carrying around like a secret. He unlocked his phone, opened his gallery, and tapped a folder labeled Junior. His whole expression softened. "Since we're stopped, look," he said, holding the screen toward Rich. Rich kept his posture forward, eyes on the road, but with the cars frozen ahead he allowed himself a quick glance. The brake lights stayed solid red, unmoving. When his gaze returned fully to the road, the reaction came, slow, warm, and unmistakable. His eyes widened, and a smile spread across his face as the resemblance settled in. "Man, he's the spitting image of you." Latham exhaled, pride and nerves flickering across his features. Ahead of them, the brake lights began to blink out one by one as traffic started inching forward again. Latham said, "Rich, there's something I never told you about her." "About Ying." Rich kept his eyes forward but angled his body slightly, giving Latham space to talk, his jaw softening in a subtle sign that he was listening without judgment. Latham said, a small, embarrassed laugh slipping out. Back when I was TRO, I had that habit of giving girls nicknames. Thought it made me smooth. Player stuff. You know. Rich smirked. Latham continued, well, when I met Ying, I called her Angel. At first it was just me being me. Nothing deep. But then she opened up to me. The SUV eased forward again as the pedestrians cleared the street. She told me her real name, Ying, was hard for her to hear. Not because she didn't like it, but because every time someone said it, it reminded her of everything she went through. The bullying. The way her own people treated her. The birthmark. Her teeth. The ADHD. All of it. Rich listened intensely, his grip loosening slightly on the steering wheel as empathy settled in. Latham continued, she told me she never felt like she belonged anywhere. Not even in her own culture. And hearing her name, it was like hearing every insult all over again. Latham swallowed. But when I called her Angel, she said it was the only time she ever felt happy hearing someone call her anything. She said it didn't hurt. It didn't remind her of being rejected. It reminded her of the one time someone saw her as something good. He paused, jaw tightening as the realization hit him. And everything was good, until I hurt her. His head dropped, shoulders folding inward. Man, I messed that up. A memory flickered across his face, her smile, her trust, and the weight of losing it pressed into his chest. Rich encouraged him by saying, at least you recognize it now and you're willing to change. Latham nodded slowly, lifting his head again. The guilt was still there, but something steadier sat beside it now. Rich gave him a small, confident smile. You got this. You've got time now to make it right. Latham exhaled, the tension easing from his shoulders. Yeah, I want to. And now I get what you meant. When you said karma changed you. I get it now. Rich nodded knowingly. I can't wait to meet my son, Latham said. His mom, she wants me in his life. She said she can't raise a boy alone. And she forgave me. After the misery I put her life through, she forgave me. She's got a heart of an angel. She doesn't want anything from me except to help raise our son. Rich turned onto another road and said, I don't think I've ever met her. Ying, right? Latham responded, yeah, she's Asian American. Sweetest woman you'll ever meet. I wasn't mature when I met her. I hurt her. But she reached out anyway. And as soon as I saw the pictures, I knew. That's my boy. And I want to do right. I want to support her. Make sure she's okay. Make sure our son is okay. Rich smiled. I'm glad someone gets to see the man you've become. Not the old you. The new you. That's exactly how I feel, Latham said. She's giving me a chance. And I'm excited to see her again. She's the type of woman you can take home to meet your mother. Classy. Rich asked jokingly, what in the world did she see in you? Latham laughed, oh come on. I wasn't that bad. She liked the way I made her laugh, charm, my swag, my smile, my handsomeness, my... Rich chuckled, okay, I get the point. Latham said, in all seriousness though, if I wasn't badly behaving and being reckless, I would have married her. Rich replied, she was that special huh? Latham nodded but then had a slight frown, yeah, she was. And she would have loved me unconditionally if I wasn't acting like a complete a-hole towards her. He paused and thought for a moment, glancing out the window as the city lights streaked past. But I guess it's like you said, I'm not that guy anymore. Rich nodded, that's right. You're a responsible Marine now and she will see that. Those words made Latham straighten up and regain his composure. He adjusted his posture, shoulders back, remembering that he was a Marine, not TRO, and he was able to become positive again and think about his son that he's never met. Latham said, "When I saw you with Karma, it changed you. From felony to father. And I guess I was jealous. Not in a bad way. Just wishing I had that. Wishing I could spend time with my kids." Rich chuckled. "So no more emails saying, 'Shooters shoot,' right?" Latham burst out laughing. "Are you still gonna hold that over my head? That was a long time ago." "Oh, I'm absolutely holding it over your head," Rich said, laughing with him. "That was completely inappropriate advice to give me about Rôvi." Latham shook his head, smiling. "But that's my point. I'm not that guy anymore. I want to be a father. I want to do this right. And I want to know, how do I bond with him? How do I approach this? What would you do?" Rich took a breath, thoughtful. The turn signal clicked softly in the quiet, giving the moment weight. "All right," Rich said, keeping his eyes on the road but softening his voice. "I'm gonna tell you this in 2 parts. First part. The responsible part. You need to connect with Dr. Blake and Tarquin about this. For real. This is their field. This is what they do. And technically, you're still in the re-entry program, you just had to pause it when you re-enlisted. So this is actually the perfect time to finish what you started. They can walk you through the emotional side, the bonding side, the pacing, all of that." Latham nodded slowly, absorbing it. "Yeah, you're right." Rich continued, "They'll help you figure out how to approach Ying, how to approach your son, how to build something stable. That's their lane." Then Rich's tone shifted, warmer, more personal. "But second part. Buddy to buddy." Latham turned toward him, listening. "If it makes you feel more comfortable seeing Ying again, I'm about to go pick up Karma. If you want, Karma and I can swing by her place with you. You can tell her I just picked you up from the airport. And having Karma there, man, that's an instant magnet for your little boy. Kids gravitate toward other kids. It'll soften the whole moment." Latham's eyes brightened, hope flickering through the nerves. Rich added gently, "We can't stay long. I gotta get Karma home, fed, bathed, all that. But a short introduction, that might be the perfect way to break the ice." He glanced over at Latham with a small, reassuring smile. "That's just me talking as your friend. Not professional, not clinical, just what I'd do. But after that, you really do need to sit down with Dr. Blake and Tarquin. They'll help you figure out the rest." Latham exhaled, a mix of relief and gratitude. "Man, thank you. That actually helps a lot." Rich nodded once, firm and steady. "You're not doing this alone." The traffic finally opened up ahead, the SUV rolling forward into a quieter stretch of road as the weight between them settled into something hopeful.
The SUV rolled into Rôvi's driveway and came to a stop. Rich shifted into park. Both men unbuckled and stepped out, then climbed the front porch steps. Before they could knock, the inner door opened. Rôvi held it with one arm, leaning out slightly. "Please, come in, gentlemen." Rich nodded. "Hello, Rôvi." Latham followed. "Good to see you." As Rich stepped fully inside, he paused near the threshold and turned, waiting. Latham entered a moment later, moving slower than usual. His gaze settled on Rôvi. This was the first time he had seen her without the flowing robes, layered fabrics, or the veil that usually softened her features. "My goodness," Latham said, surprise lighting his face. "I almost didn't recognize you." His eyes moved over her once, top to bottom. You look amazing. Rôvi kept her expression professional, though a faint blush touched her cheeks. Thank you for the compliment. She gestured calmly toward the living room. Have a seat. I'll go get Karma. They both sat on the couch. Rôvi turned and walked toward the playroom. Latham shook his head slowly. Still taking her in, Latham turned to Rich, who was already looking at him. Latham said, Rôvi's looking good, isn't she? Rich nodded once. Yeah. From down the hall came Rôvi's cheerful, steady voice. Guess who's here? Your daddy's here. A delighted squeal answered. Yay, yay. Karma burst out of the playroom and ran straight into Rich's arms. Daddy, Daddy. Rich happily scooped her up and settled her seated beside him, letting her chatter excitedly about her day. Little Penny followed a few steps behind, quieter. Rôvi returned and sat in the chair across from Rich and Latham. Hi, Penny, Latham smiled, waving. Penny shyly smiled and waved back, then climbed onto the couch beside Rôvi with one of her dolls. Rôvi looked between the two men, her tone warm but professional. How has your day been going? Latham leaned forward, energy clear in his voice. My day has been amazing. I'm off active duty now, 4 years in the reserves, living as a civilian. I get to reconnect with old friends, try to fix things with family. His voice dropped slightly, excitement threading through it. And speaking of family, I actually have a son. Rôvi's face showed genuine, quiet pleasure. Really? Yeah. One of my exes reached out. Her name is Angel. She told me I have a little boy, and we're on our way to meet him right now. This will be the first time. Latham pulled out his phone, stood, and knelt beside Rôvi's chair so she could see. He turned the screen toward her. Rôvi leaned in slightly. My goodness, Latham, he is a carbon copy of you. I know. Latham laughed, pride warm in his tone. He added, and guess what his mom named him? Rôvi replied, Junior. Exactly. Latham grinned, then stood and returned to his seat beside Rich, still glancing at the photos. Rôvi watched him with calm interest. She asked, Are you nervous about meeting him? Honestly, yes, I am. A little nervous, Latham admitted. But Rich is coming with me. He's bringing Karma to help lighten the moment, just a quick introduction. Then he suggested I talk to Dr. Blake and Tarquin afterward. This is their field, the right way to approach it for everyone. Rôvi nodded. That sounds like wise advice. Latham looked at her directly. Angel is really excited to see me. And you know what? She kind of reminds me of you. Very caring heart. Sweet, kind, gentle. A faint blush rose on Rôvi's cheeks again. She lowered her head for a brief moment, then lifted it, composed. Well, I look forward to meeting her. Rich, who had been sitting quietly, spoke with a light, joking tone and a small smile. I see you're still charming the ladies. Latham held up both hands, laughing. Ha ha. Oh, no, I didn't mean it like that. I meant it in the most respectful way possible. He turned back to Rôvi, sincere. I really do mean it. You remind me of her. I can't wait for you to meet. She's coming to Dr. Blake's next seminar. The one on cultural trauma, I think. Rôvi gave a small, professional nod and smile. I look forward to it as well. Rich glanced at his watch. We should get going. The men stood. Penny offered a cute little wave. Rich and Latham waved back. Rich looked at Rôvi. I see you're doing double babysitting today. Yes, Rôvi said. Bonnie and Charles went to the airport to pick up Robert. He's finishing his service and moving into the reserves, similar to Latham. Rich nodded. I'll text you when I'm bringing Karma back tomorrow. Okay. Talk to you later, Rôvi replied with a calm smile.
The men stepped outside, Rich buckled Karma into her car seat, then climbed behind the wheel. As they pulled away from the house, Latham glanced over at Rich. Wow, she sure looks different without her usual princely attire, doesn't she? Rich kept his eyes on the road. He didn't respond right away. His face stayed neutral, impossible to read. After a moment, he gave a slow nod and a quiet, closed mouth. Latham caught the tone, understood it, and let it go. He shifted his attention back to Karma. Karma giggled. Playing with her doll, Rich checked the rear-view mirror. Karma, this is Latham. The little girl waved her small hand, hi. Latham waved back gently, hi, Karma. They continued down the road toward Angel's house, the afternoon stretching ahead.
The drive continued with Latham talking animatedly about the new apartment Rich had helped him secure and the mechanic job opportunities lined up through the dealership in Rocky. In the back seat, Karma played happily with her doll, babbling softly to herself, as grounded and content as any toddler could be. Soon they pulled into Angel's driveway. The modest trailer park was quiet, the home simple but well kept. Rich showed zero judgment as he parked. Latham showed none either. If anything, seeing the humble setup made Latham's shoulders square a little more, a quiet protectiveness settling over him. He knew she had quit her job to care for their son alone. They stepped out. Rich walked around, unbuckled Karma, and slung the little diaper bag over his shoulder. He scooped her up into his arms. Latham reached the door first and knocked. Rich scanned the area out of instinct, not judgment, just that old, cautious awareness. The door swung open. Angel stood there, petite and composed. A modest smile crossed her face. Latham beamed. Angel. She grinned back. "T-R-O." He stepped forward and pulled her into a warm hug. She returned it lightly, then stepped back with a soft blush. Her gaze shifted to Rich and Karma. Latham turned. "This is my friend Rich. He picked me up from the airport. We won't be able to stay long, he has to get his little girl home, but he came with me." "That's fine," Angel said softly. "Please, come in." The trailer was clean and quaint, with a few toys scattered neatly in the living room. Rich stepped inside. Karma immediately wiggled, wanting down, but Rich held her firmly, assessing the space first. She fussed briefly, then quieted. Angel gestured toward the couch. "Have a seat. I'll go get Junior." Latham sat quickly, anxious energy clear. Rich lowered himself more slowly, eyes quietly sweeping the room. Angel returned holding a sleepy-eyed toddler. Junior's gaze locked immediately on Karma. Karma stared right back. The two toddlers zoomed in on each other like magnets. Karma smiled and squirmed harder. Rich held her tight. Latham rose and walked over. Angel set Junior down. The little boy looked up at Latham with innocent curiosity. Latham dropped to one knee, then sat cross-legged in front of him, a gentle smile on his face. He was speechless for a long moment, staring at a mirror image of himself. The same wide-set eyes, the same stubborn chin. Only the darker hair hinted at Angel's side. Angel offered Rich a bottle of water and a small snack for Karma. Would she like something? Rich thanked her politely. "We're fine. Appreciate it." She nodded and returned to the floor beside Latham and Junior. Junior glanced at Karma again and smiled. Karma waved. The little boy looked up at Latham. Angel spoke softly, "Junior, this is Daddy. This is your dad." "Dada," Junior repeated in his small voice. "Yes," Angel said gently. "This is your dad." Latham reached for a little car and rolled it gently. Junior's face lit up. He toddled over and handed Latham his favorite Buzz Lightyear figure. Latham's eyes brightened as he played alongside him. Later, spotting the Woody doll, Latham pulled the string. Junior giggled at the cowboy's voice. Latham hummed the Toy Story theme, and the boys' laughter grew. Karma patted Rich's chest, pointing at the toys. Rich shook his head once, calm but firm. She quieted and watched. He knew another child on the floor would pull Junior's attention away from Latham. This moment needed space. After a few more minutes of play, Junior wandered over to Karma and waved. Karma waved back and smiled. Junior then went back to the floor in front of Latham and kept playing. Latham played back with him in his silly voices. After some time, Angel looked up. "I was about to start dinner. Would you like to stay?" Latham shook his head regretfully. "Not this time. I don't want to overwhelm him. Just a short intro today. But I'll definitely come back." "I look forward to that," Angel said. Latham met her eyes, voice softer. "You know, back in the day everybody called me TRO. That's all anyone ever used. But you were the only one who ever asked my real name. You wanted to call me Latham. I always thought it sounded kind of nerdy, but you liked it. You even gave our son that name. Now that I've grown up and actually go by Latham, it means even more." Angel smiled with a surprised look on her face and said, "Oh, so you don't go by TRO anymore?" Latham shook his head. "Nope, Marines don't use nicknames. That name is attached to a part of me that no longer exists." Angel's eyes softened, a tear gathering. "You don't know how much it means to see how you've changed. I really do look forward to getting to know this version of you." Rich stood, signaling it was time. Latham rose as well. He gave Angel another hug. "It was really nice to see you," she replied. "It was good to see you too. But this was the kind of hug that silently said, I miss you. I miss this. I miss us." And when they finally let go, they both knew it. "I'll call you tonight," Latham promised. "Okay," she replied. Junior waved a big, silly, bye-bye, at everyone. The adults waved back as the toddler giggled brightly. Rich stepped outside first, scanning the area protectively as he buckled Karma into her car seat. Latham followed and climbed in. Once the trailer park faded behind them, Rich's shoulders eased. Latham let out a long breath, still buzzing. "I cannot believe how much he looks like me. You know what? I think I finally understand what it means to be a dad." Like, instantly. "I get how you felt when Karma came into your life." Rich kept his eyes on the road, and said, "That was a beautiful moment to witness."
Dr. Blake stepped forward with a calm, steady presence that brought the room to quiet without effort. He rested his hands lightly on the podium and allowed the silence to settle into something intentional. "Good afternoon, everyone." His voice carried warmth without losing its professionalism. "Thank you for being here. Today's seminar addresses a subject that is rarely spoken about openly, even within the communities where it happens. We are here to examine cultural rejection. Not the kind that comes from strangers, but the kind that comes from the people who raised us, the people we trusted, and the environments that shaped us." He scanned the room slowly, acknowledging each person without lingering long enough to create discomfort. When a child receives messages about their skin tone, their features, their hair, their body, or their identity, those messages do not disappear with age. They settle into the nervous system. They shape self-worth. They influence relationships. They determine how someone sees themselves long before they have the language to understand what is happening. He paused, letting the truth of that statement land. Our purpose today is not to blame cultures or condemn families. Our purpose is to understand the patterns that get passed down silently, generation after generation. Patterns that teach children to alter themselves in order to belong. Patterns that tell them their natural features are wrong. Patterns that create lifelong wounds. He gestured toward the panel seated behind him. You will hear from specialists who study identity, trauma, cultural norms, and group dynamics. You will also hear from individuals who have lived these experiences. Their stories are not exaggerations. They are not isolated incidents. They are examples of what many endure quietly. Nothing shared today is insignificant. Nothing is imagined. Pain that comes from your own community is real, and it deserves to be named with clarity and respect. He took a slow breath. Our goal is simple: to understand what happens when belonging breaks, and to explore what it takes to rebuild it. He stepped slightly to the side, opening the space for the next phase of the seminar. We will begin with lived experience. Real stories. Real histories. When you are ready, we will start. We are now moving into the lived experience portion of this seminar, he said. This is where the clinical framework meets real stories. These stories are not case studies from textbooks. They are the experiences of individuals who grew up inside cultures that taught them to question their own worth. He looked toward the front row where the guest participants sat. His posture conveyed both authority and care. Each person who speaks today will share a complete narrative. Not fragments. Not summaries. A full account of what cultural rejection looked like in their childhood, how it shaped their identity, how it affected their nervous system, and how it continues to influence their adult life. He paused, letting the room absorb the seriousness of what was about to happen. These stories are educational. They are awareness tools. They help us understand the psychological, cultural, and generational forces that shape self-perception. They also help us recognize the patterns that are often dismissed, minimized, or normalized within communities. He shifted his attention to the first guest. I want to begin with someone whose experience reflects a pattern that is widespread across multiple cultures, yet rarely acknowledged openly. This individual grew up receiving messages about their skin tone, their features, and their worth long before they understood what those messages meant. He nodded gently. Angel, thank you for being willing to speak. When you are ready, please share your story with us. Take your time. You have the floor. The room grew still, the kind of stillness that comes when everyone understands the importance of what is about to be said. Kaikoa stood slowly. She took a breath, steady but deliberate, and looked toward Dr. Blake before addressing the room. My name is Kaikoa. I'm Filipino-American, and I grew up in a household where skin tone was a constant topic. Not in a casual way. Not in a passing comment. It was woven into everything. In my family, lighter skin was treated like a form of achievement. Something to protect. Something to maintain. Something that made you more valuable. I learned that before I learned how to multiply. Before I learned how to spell my own name. Her voice remained calm, but the clarity in it carried weight. When I was 10, my aunt handed me a bar of whitening soap. She didn't explain it. She didn't have to. She just said, use this so you don't get darker. I remember standing in the shower that night, reading the label over and over, trying to understand what was wrong with me. She paused. I was told to stay out of the sun. I was told my lighter cousins were prettier. I was told my natural features were too ethnic. I didn't have the language for it then, but I understand now that I was being taught a hierarchy. A system, a ranking of worth based on shade. She looked down briefly, then lifted her gaze again. I internalized all of it. I learned to monitor myself. I learned to avoid the sun. I learned to compare my skin to everyone around me. I learned to shrink in photos. I learned to hide my arms in the summer. I learned to apologize for my own complexion without ever saying the words out loud. Her tone remained steady, almost clinical in its clarity. The hardest part wasn't the comments. It was the silence around them. The way everyone acted like this was normal. Like this was love. Like this was guidance. No one questioned it. No one challenged it. It was presented as cultural wisdom, not harm. She let that settle. As I got older, the messages didn't stop. They just changed shape. Instead of being told to lighten my skin, I was told to maintain it. Instead of being told my features were too ethnic, I was told to enhance them in ways that made them look less like my own. I was encouraged to buy products that promised to erase the parts of me that connected me to my heritage. I want to be clear about something. My family didn't wake up and decide to hurt me. They were repeating what was taught to them. They were passing down a standard they believed would protect me. A standard rooted in colonization, in history, in survival. But even if the intention wasn't harm, the impact was. She took another breath. The impact was growing up believing that my natural self was a problem to solve. The impact was developing anxiety around my appearance. The impact was feeling inferior next to lighter-skinned women. The impact was learning to evaluate myself through a lens that wasn't mine. She looked toward the panel, then back to the room. I'm sharing this because I know I'm not the only one. Skin lightening products are still marketed to children. Shade hierarchies still exist in Filipino communities. And many of us are still trying to unlearn the idea that lighter means better. Her voice remained steady, but there was a quiet strength in it now. I'm here because I want to understand how to heal from something that was presented as normal. I want to understand how to separate cultural pride from cultural harm. And I want to understand how to build a sense of worth that isn't dependent on a shade chart. She exhaled slowly. That's my story. Thank you for listening. Kaikoa sat down, her posture composed, her expression calm, but the room carried the weight of what she had shared.
Dr. Blake stepped forward again, giving Kaikoa a small, respectful nod before addressing the room. Thank you, Kaikoa. What you shared reflects a pattern that appears across many cultures, and it is important to understand the psychological mechanisms behind it. His tone remained steady, clinical, and clear. When a child receives repeated messages about their skin tone or features, the nervous system interprets those messages as information about safety and belonging. A child does not have the cognitive ability to evaluate cultural standards or question the logic behind them. A child only knows this. The people who care for me are telling me something about myself, so it must be true. He rested one hand lightly on the podium. In Kaikoa's experience, the message was consistent and repeated. Avoid the sun, lighten your skin, protect your shade. These instructions were framed as guidance, but the underlying message was that her natural complexion was a liability. Over time, the nervous system internalizes this as a threat to belonging. He continued with calm precision. When belonging feels conditional, the body responds with vigilance. Children in these situations often develop patterns such as monitoring their appearance, comparing themselves to others, avoiding situations that might darken their skin, or feeling anxiety when they cannot control how they look. These are not superficial concerns. They are survival strategies. He allowed the room a moment to absorb that. Cultural rejection of this kind is often presented as tradition, preference, or protection. But the impact is psychological. It shapes identity formation. It alters self-perception. It creates a hierarchy within the child's mind where their natural features are placed at the bottom. His voice remained even, but there was a quiet gravity in his words. Kaikoa mentioned that her family did not intend harm. That is an important point. Many families believe they are preparing their children for a world that rewards certain appearances. However, intention does not erase impact. The nervous system does not process intention. It processes experience. He shifted slightly, maintaining his grounded posture. Kaikoa also described the silence around these messages. Silence is a powerful reinforcer. When no one questions a harmful standard, the child learns that the standard is absolute. This creates what we call internalized hierarchy. The child begins to police themselves long after the external comments stop. He looked toward Kaikoa again, acknowledging her courage without centering her discomfort. What Kaikoa described is not vanity. It is not insecurity. It is the long-term effect of a cultural system that assigns value based on shade. Systems like this do not simply influence beauty preferences. They influence identity, confidence, and the ability to feel at home in one's own body. He returned his attention to the room. As we continue, I want everyone to keep this in mind. Cultural rejection is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, consistent, and woven into daily life. Those are the wounds that last the longest. He stepped back slightly, signaling the transition.
Tarquin steps forward. What Kaikoa described is something I have heard in many community spaces, and it is important to understand how it feels from the inside. When a child is told to stay out of the sun or handed whitening products, it does not feel like a suggestion. It feels like a warning. It tells the child that something about them is unsafe, undesirable, or in need of correction. He glanced toward the audience, ensuring his words were clear rather than confrontational. In many communities, these messages are delivered casually. They are woven into daily routines. They are framed as guidance or preparation for the world. But for the child, it becomes a constant reminder that their natural appearance is a liability. It becomes something they must manage, monitor, and control. His voice remained steady, grounded in lived experience rather than theory. When Kaikoa said she learned to monitor herself, that is something many people do without realizing it. They learn to avoid sunlight. They learn to compare their shade to others. They learn to adjust their posture in photos. They learn to hide parts of themselves that they were told would make them less acceptable. These are not cosmetic habits. They are survival strategies. He paused briefly, allowing the room to absorb the emotional truth behind the clinical explanation. This is not vanity. This is not insecurity. This is a child trying to survive a standard that was handed to them before they had the language to question it. When the people you trust tell you that lighter skin is better, you internalize it as a rule. Not a preference. A rule. He continued with the same calm, articulate presence. Kaikoa mentioned the silence around these messages. That silence is powerful. When no one challenges a harmful standard, the child learns that the standard is absolute. They learn that questioning it would make them the problem. So they carry the weight quietly, often for years. He shifted his stance slightly, keeping his tone even. In community settings, we often talk about pride, heritage, and resilience. But we rarely talk about the parts of culture that teach children to shrink themselves. We rarely talk about the pressure to alter features that are tied to ancestry. We rarely talk about the emotional cost of being told that your natural self needs correction. He looked toward Kaikoa with respect, then back to the room. What Kaikoa shared is not an isolated experience. It is a pattern that many carry into adulthood. It affects confidence. It affects relationships. It affects the ability to feel at home in one's own body. And it often takes years to unlearn. My role here is to make sure we do not treat these stories as distant concepts. They are lived realities. They shape identity in ways that are often invisible until someone finally names them. He stepped back slightly, signaling that his translation was complete.
The cultural psychologist steps forward. What Kaikoa described is not only a personal experience. It is a reflection of a cultural system shaped by history, colonization, and generational transmission. In many communities, including Filipino communities, shade hierarchy did not originate within the culture itself. It was introduced, reinforced, and normalized through centuries of external influence. During periods of colonization, lighter skin became associated with power, access, and proximity to the ruling class. Over time, these associations became embedded in social structures. They influenced beauty standards, marriage expectations, employment opportunities, and perceptions of intelligence and worth. Even after colonization ended, the psychological residue remained. When a family member hands a child whitening soap, they are not acting in isolation. They are participating in a cultural script that has been passed down for generations. This script teaches that lighter skin offers protection, opportunity, and social acceptance. It is framed as guidance, but it is rooted in a hierarchy that was imposed on the culture long before the child was born. It is important to understand that these messages are not simply about appearance. They are about identity. They are about belonging. They are about perceived safety within a social structure that has rewarded certain features and penalized others. When a child internalizes these messages, they are not internalizing beauty preferences. They are internalizing a worldview. Kaikoa mentioned the silence around these messages. Silence is one of the strongest transmitters of cultural norms. When a harmful standard is never questioned, it becomes invisible. It becomes part of the cultural air. Children learn it without anyone needing to say it directly. This is how cultural hierarchies sustain themselves across generations. Another important point is the emotional framing. These messages are often delivered with affection, concern, or a desire to protect. This creates a conflict for the child. The same people who provide love are also the ones reinforcing a hierarchy that diminishes the child's natural features. This creates what we call cultural dissonance. The child learns to associate care with correction. What Kaikoa described is not a failure of individual family members. It is the result of a cultural system that has been shaped by external forces and maintained through internal repetition. Understanding this helps us separate personal intention from cultural inheritance. To heal from this, individuals often need to reconstruct their sense of identity outside of the inherited hierarchy. They must learn to see their features as belonging to them, not to a system that ranked them. This is difficult work, but it is possible. And it begins with naming the pattern, as Kaikoa has done today.
The sociologist rose with a calm, deliberate posture, the kind that signaled both respect for Kaikoa's story and a commitment to naming the structures behind it. What Kaikoa described is not only a personal experience and not only a cultural pattern. It is a social system. In-group harm operates through norms, expectations, and unspoken rules that are passed down within a community. These rules are not random. They are shaped by history, reinforced by institutions, and maintained through silence. In-group harm is powerful precisely because it comes from the people who are supposed to provide safety. When the source of harm is external, individuals can identify it as discrimination. When the source is internal, it becomes harder to name, harder to challenge, harder to separate from love, loyalty, and cultural identity. They continued with clarity. In Kaikoa's case, the messages about skin tone were not isolated comments. They were part of a social hierarchy that has been normalized within the community. This hierarchy is not simply about beauty. It is about access. It is about perceived respectability. It is about who is treated as more valuable within the group. In-group harm often hides behind the language of care. Families say they want to protect the child. They want the child to have opportunities. They want the child to be accepted. But the method of protection reinforces the very hierarchy that harms the child. This is what makes in-group harm so difficult to dismantle. It is harm delivered through the language of love. Another key sociological factor is normalization. When everyone in a community participates in the same pattern, the pattern becomes invisible. It becomes tradition. It becomes common sense. It becomes something that is not questioned because questioning it would disrupt the social order. In-group harm is sustained through three mechanisms. First, repetition. The same messages are delivered across generations. Second, silence. No one challenges the hierarchy, so it becomes unquestioned truth. Third, social reward. Individuals who conform to the standard receive praise, validation, and perceived safety. When a child grows up in this environment, they learn that belonging is conditional. They learn that acceptance requires modification. They learn that their natural features are negotiable. This creates what we call internalized group policing. The individual begins to enforce the hierarchy on themselves long after the external pressure stops. It is important to understand that in-group harm is not a failure of culture. It is a response to historical trauma, colonization, and social stratification. Communities internalize the standards of the dominant group and then enforce those standards internally. This is how oppression becomes self-sustaining. To heal from in-group harm, individuals must separate cultural identity from inherited hierarchy. Communities must learn to question the norms that were passed down without examination. And we must create spaces where stories like Kaiko's are spoken openly, because naming the pattern is the first step in dismantling it. The sociologist stepped back, signaling that their analysis was complete.
Mateo stood slowly, adjusting the sleeve of his shirt as if steadying himself before speaking. He took a quiet breath and looked toward Dr. Blake, then toward the room. My name is Mateo. I am Puerto Rican, and my story is about hair. Not in a superficial way. Not in a style choice way. In my family, hair was treated like a measurement of discipline, respectability, and worth. From the time I was little, I heard the same comments over and over. Your hair is too nappy. Fix that before school. You look unprofessional with curls. These were not suggestions. They were instructions. They were warnings. They were reminders that my natural texture was a problem. My curls were tight, thick, coarse. They grew upward instead of lying flat. And in my family, that was treated like something that needed correction. I was told that straight hair looked cleaner, more presentable, more respectable, more Puerto Rican, as if my curls made me less connected to my own culture. When I was 8, my mother started using chemical relaxers on me. I remember the smell. I remember the burning. I remember sitting still because I was told that if I moved, it would come out uneven and I would look worse. I remember the way my scalp felt afterward. Raw, tender, sometimes bleeding. I did not understand that the pain was not normal. I thought it was part of growing up. I thought it was what boys with hair like mine were supposed to do. I thought it was the price of being acceptable. The chemicals damaged my scalp. I developed burns. My hair thinned permanently in certain areas. Even now, as an adult, I have patches that will never grow back the same. And every time I look in the mirror, I see the places where my culture told me my natural DNA was unacceptable. I avoid photos. I avoid barbers who do not understand my texture. I avoid humidity because it brings my curls back and I still hear those childhood comments in my head. I have spent years trying to unlearn the idea that my hair makes me unprofessional, unkempt, or less worthy. I want to be clear about something. My family did not wake up and decide to hurt me. They were repeating what they were taught. They believed straight hair meant opportunity. They believed curls meant struggle. They believed they were protecting me from judgment. But the impact was that I learned to judge myself. I grew up believing that my natural texture was something to hide. Something to fix. Something that needed chemicals to be acceptable. And even now, I am still trying to understand what it means to see my curls as mine, not as a problem. I am sharing this because hair discrimination is not only a women's issue. It affects boys. It affects men. It affects anyone whose texture does not match the standard their community has decided is respectable. And it leaves marks that are not only physical. That is my story. Thank you for listening. Matteo sat down, composed but visibly lighter, as if naming the truth had loosened something inside him.
Dr. Blake stepped forward again, giving Matteo a steady, respectful nod before addressing the room. Thank you, Matteo. What you shared reflects a form of in-group harm that is often overlooked, especially when it affects boys and men. Hair is not simply a cosmetic feature. For many children, it becomes a site of identity formation, belonging, and self-perception. When a child is repeatedly told that their natural texture is unacceptable, the nervous system interprets that message as a threat to social safety. When a child hears phrases such as, "Fix that before school," or, "You look unprofessional with curls," the message is not about grooming. It is about worth. It is about whether the child's natural features align with the standards of the group. And when those standards are enforced through criticism, correction, or chemical alteration, the child learns that their natural self is a liability. In Matteo's case, the use of chemical relaxers at such a young age created a direct association between pain and acceptability. The burning, the scalp damage, the thinning hair, these experiences become encoded in the nervous system. The body remembers the discomfort long after the chemicals are gone. This creates a pattern where the child learns to endure harm in order to be seen as presentable. Children do not have the cognitive capacity to separate cultural norms from personal value. When the people they trust insist on altering their hair, the child internalizes the belief that their natural texture is unprofessional, unattractive, or inferior. Over time, this becomes internalized policing. The child begins to monitor themselves, avoid situations that reveal their natural texture, and feel anxiety when they cannot control their appearance. Matteo described avoiding photos and struggling with his reflection. These are not superficial reactions. They are symptoms of a deeper injury to identity. When a child is taught that their natural DNA is unacceptable, the injury is not to the hair. It is to the self. It is important to recognize that Matteo's family, like many families, believed they were preparing him for a world that rewards certain appearances. They believed straight hair would protect him from judgment. But intention does not erase impact. The nervous system does not process intention. It processes experience. What Matteo described is not vanity. It is not insecurity. It is the long-term effect of a cultural standard that equates straight hair with respectability and curls with disorder. These standards are rooted in history, hierarchy, and assimilation pressures. They shape identity in ways that last well into adulthood. As we continue, I want everyone to understand that in-group harm often hides behind the language of care. It is delivered quietly, consistently, and with the belief that it will help the child succeed. But the psychological cost is significant. And the work of healing begins with naming the pattern, as Matteo has done today. He stepped back slightly, signaling the transition. Thank you again, Matteo. We will now move to the next layer of analysis.
Tarquin stepped forward with a steady, composed presence, acknowledging Matteo with a respectful nod before turning to the room. His voice carried the calm clarity of someone who has heard stories like this many times, but never treats them as routine. What Mateo described is something many boys in Puerto Rican and Afro-Latino communities experience, but rarely talk about. When a child is told that their curls are unprofessional or that their hair needs to be fixed before they can walk out the door, it does not feel like grooming advice. It feels like a warning. It tells the child that their natural texture is a problem that must be corrected before they can be seen. In many families, these comments are delivered casually. They are woven into morning routines. They are framed as discipline, respectability, or preparation for the world. But for the child, the message is clear. Your natural hair is not acceptable. Your natural texture is not welcome. Your natural self is not enough. When Mateo talked about the relaxers, that is something many children go through without understanding what is happening to them. They sit still while chemicals burn their scalp because they are told it will make them look better. They learn to associate pain with improvement. They learn that discomfort is the price of being presentable. They learn that their natural curls are something to erase. The burns, the thinning, the permanent damage, those are not just physical injuries. They become reminders. Every time Mateo looks in the mirror and sees the places where his hair will never grow back the same, he is seeing the imprint of a message he received as a child. Your natural DNA is unacceptable. This is not vanity. This is not insecurity. This is the long-term impact of being told that your natural features are unprofessional. When a child hears that message repeatedly, they internalize it. They begin to police themselves. They avoid photos. They avoid humidity. They avoid situations where their curls might show. They learn to hide parts of themselves before anyone else can comment. In-group harm is powerful because it comes from the people who are supposed to protect you. When the same hands that feed you, clothe you, and care for you also apply chemicals that burn your scalp, the child learns a complicated lesson about love. They learn that acceptance requires alteration. They learn that belonging comes with conditions. What Mateo described is not an isolated experience. It is a pattern shaped by history, by colonization, by internalized hierarchy, and by generations of families trying to prepare their children for a world that judges them harshly. But the preparation becomes its own form of harm. My role here is to make sure we do not treat Mateo's story as a cosmetic issue. It is a story about identity. It is a story about belonging. It is a story about the emotional cost of being told that your natural self needs correction. And it is a story many carry quietly into adulthood. Tarquin stepped back, signaling that his translation was complete.
The cultural psychologist stepped forward. What Mateo described is not an isolated incident. It is the result of a long lineage of cultural conditioning that began far before he was born. In Puerto Rican and Afro-Latino communities, hair has been a site of identity, hierarchy, and social meaning for centuries. The pressure to straighten curls is not simply a grooming preference. It is a cultural inheritance shaped by colonization, racial stratification, and internalized hierarchy. During Spanish colonization and later under United States influence, European features were positioned as the standard of respectability. Straight hair became associated with discipline, professionalism, and social mobility. Curls, especially tight curls, were associated with African ancestry, which was devalued within the imposed racial hierarchy. Over generations, these associations became embedded in cultural norms. When Mateo's family insisted that his curls were unprofessional or needed to be fixed, they were not inventing a new standard. They were repeating a message that has been transmitted across generations. This message is not about aesthetics. It is about perceived safety. Families often believe that straightening a child's hair will protect them from judgment, discrimination, or exclusion. It is important to understand that these messages are delivered within a cultural context where appearance is tied to opportunity. Children learn early that certain features are rewarded and others are penalized. When a child is told that their curls are unacceptable, they internalize not only a beauty standard, but a social hierarchy. Chemical relaxers, especially when used on children, are a direct expression of this hierarchy. They communicate that the child's natural texture is incompatible with the expectations of the group. The physical pain Matteo described is significant, but the psychological message is even more powerful. The child learns that their natural self requires correction. Another important element is the emotional framing. These grooming practices are often delivered with care, concern, or a desire to prepare the child for the world. This creates a conflict within the child's developing identity. The same people who provide love are also the ones reinforcing a hierarchy that diminishes the child's natural features. This creates what we call cultural dissonance. Matteo's avoidance of photos and discomfort with his reflection are not superficial reactions. They are the result of years of internalized messaging that equated his natural texture with disorder, unprofessionalism, or inferiority. These outcomes are consistent with research on identity development in communities where appearance is heavily policed. To heal from this, individuals often need to reconstruct their sense of identity outside of the inherited hierarchy. They must learn to see their curls as part of their heritage rather than a liability. This is difficult work, because it requires unlearning messages that were delivered early, consistently, and with emotional authority.
Hannah stood slowly, her posture careful, as if she were preparing her body before preparing her voice. She took a quiet breath and looked toward Dr. Blake, then toward the room. "My name is Hannah. I am Korean American, and I grew up in a family where double eyelid surgery was treated like a normal milestone. Something expected, something routine, something every girl was supposed to do. From the time I was little, I heard the same comments. Your eyes look tired. You would be prettier with surgery. All the girls get it. Why will you not?" These were not insults. They were delivered casually, as if they were helpful observations. As if they were preparing me for something. When I was 14, my aunt offered to pay for the procedure. She said it the way someone might offer to buy a child a new backpack for school. Practical, expected, normal. I remember nodding politely, but inside I felt something collapse. I felt defective. I felt like my face had failed some kind of test. I grew up with monolids. They were the eyes I inherited from my parents, my grandparents, my ancestors. But in my community, monolids were treated like a flaw. Something that needed to be fixed. Something that made you look tired, sad, or less attractive. I learned that before I learned how to drive. Before I learned how to advocate for myself. I started avoiding eye contact. Not because I was shy, but because I did not want anyone looking directly at the part of my face that everyone kept telling me needed surgery. I learned to angle my head in photos. I learned to hide behind bangs. I learned to keep my eyes slightly lowered so no one would comment. The hardest part was that the pressure came from inside the culture. Not from strangers, not from media, from family. From people who loved me. They believed they were helping me. They believed they were giving me an advantage. They believed they were preparing me for a world that rewards certain features. But the impact was that I learned to see my natural eyes as a problem. I learned to evaluate myself through a standard that was not mine. I learned to feel inferior next to girls who had the surgery. I learned to believe that my face needed correction before it could be considered beautiful. I want to be clear. My family did not intend harm. They were repeating what they were taught. They were passing down a standard that has existed in Korean culture for generations. A standard shaped by history, colonization, and beauty norms that have been reinforced for decades. But even if the intention was care, the impact was harm. I am still unlearning the idea that my eyes need to be changed. I am still trying to understand what it means to see my face as mine, not as something that needs to be fixed. And I am still working on looking people in the eye without feeling exposed. That is my story. Thank you for listening. Hannah sat down, composed but visibly relieved, as if naming the truth had loosened something inside her.
Dr. Blake stepped forward again, giving Hannah a steady, respectful nod before addressing the room. Thank you, Hannah. What you shared reflects a form of appearance-based in-group pressure that is both common and deeply misunderstood. Double eyelid surgery is often framed as a simple cosmetic choice, but for many children, it becomes a message about identity, belonging, and perceived adequacy. When a child repeatedly hears comments such as, "Your eyes look tired," or, "You would be prettier with surgery," the nervous system does not interpret these statements as neutral observations. It interprets them as information about safety and acceptance. A child learns very quickly that certain features are valued and others are treated as deficiencies. In Hannah's case, the offer of surgery at 14 is significant. When a family member presents a surgical procedure as routine or expected, the child internalizes the belief that their natural features are not sufficient. This creates a form of identity injury. The child begins to see their face not as an expression of heritage, but as a problem to be corrected. Children do not have the cognitive capacity to separate cultural norms from personal worth. When the people they trust imply that their eyes need to be altered, the child internalizes the message that their natural appearance is inadequate. Over time, this can lead to avoidance behaviors, such as avoiding eye contact or altering posture in photos. These are not signs of vanity. They are signs of self-protection. It is important to understand that these messages are often delivered with care. Families believe they are helping the child succeed in a world that rewards certain features. They believe they are offering an advantage. But intention does not erase impact. The nervous system does not process intention. It processes experience. Hannah described feeling defective for having monolids. That reaction is consistent with what we see in individuals who grow up in environments where appearance is heavily policed. When a cultural standard is presented as universal, the child learns to evaluate themselves through that standard. They learn to see their natural features as deviations rather than expressions of identity. What Hannah described is not a superficial issue. It is a form of cultural conditioning that shapes self-perception, confidence, and the ability to feel at home in one's own face. These messages can persist well into adulthood, influencing social interactions, self-esteem, and emotional regulation. As we continue, I want everyone to understand that in-group appearance pressure is powerful because it is delivered quietly, consistently, and with emotional authority. It becomes part of the environment. It becomes part of the child's internal narrative. And it takes time, awareness, and support to unlearn. He stepped back slightly, signaling the transition. Thank you again, Hannah. We will now move to the next layer of analysis.
Tarquin stepped forward with a composed, grounded presence, acknowledging Hannah with a quiet nod before turning to the room. His voice carried the steady clarity of someone who understands how cultural pressure becomes woven into a child's sense of self long before they have the language to name it. What Hannah described is something many Korean and Korean American children experience, but often in silence. When a child hears comments such as, "Your eyes look tired," or, "You would be prettier with surgery," those words do not land as casual observations. They land as evaluations. They tell the child that their natural features are not meeting the standard. In many families, these comments are delivered gently. They are framed as guidance, as preparation, as something every girl eventually does. But for the child, the message is unmistakable. Your natural eyes are not enough. Your face needs to be corrected before it can be considered beautiful. When Hannah talked about her aunt offering to pay for the surgery at 14, that is something many young people encounter. The offer is presented as generosity, as support, as a practical step toward adulthood. But underneath that gesture is a message that can be deeply wounding. Your face requires intervention. Your features are not acceptable as they are. Children do not separate cultural norms from personal worth. When the people they trust imply that their eyes need to be altered, the child internalizes that message. They begin to see their monolids not as a natural part of their heritage, but as a flaw. They begin to compare themselves to peers who have had the surgery. They begin to feel defective. Hannah mentioned avoiding eye contact. That detail is important. When a child grows up believing that their eyes are the part of their face that needs correction, they learn to hide. They lower their gaze. They adjust their posture in photos. They avoid situations where someone might look too closely. These behaviors are not signs of shyness. They are signs of self-protection. In-group harm is powerful because it is delivered through the language of care. Families believe they are helping. They believe they are preparing the child for a world that rewards certain features. But the impact is that the child learns to evaluate themselves through a standard that was never theirs to begin with. What Hannah described is not a cosmetic issue. It is a story about identity. It is a story about belonging. It is a story about the emotional cost of being told that your natural face needs to be fixed. And it is a story many carry quietly into adulthood, long after the comments stop. Tarquin stepped back, signaling that his translation was complete.
The cultural psychologist steps forward. What Hannah described reflects a deeply rooted cultural pattern that has been present in Korean and Korean American communities for decades. Double eyelid surgery is often framed as a simple cosmetic enhancement, but its prevalence and social meaning reveals something much more complex. It is tied to history, to colonial influence, to shifting beauty norms, and to the internalization of external standards. In Korea, the rise of double eyelid surgery did not occur in isolation. It emerged in a cultural environment shaped by Western influence, modernization, and the global spread of Eurocentric beauty standards. Over time, these standards became embedded in media, advertising, and even family expectations. The result is a cultural script that equates larger, double-lidded eyes with attractiveness, professionalism, and social advantage. When Hannah's family told her that her eyes looked tired or that she would be prettier with surgery, they were not inventing a new standard. They were repeating a message that has been normalized across generations. These comments are often delivered casually, even affectionately, but they carry significant psychological weight. They communicate that monolids are a deviation from the ideal, rather than a natural expression of heritage. It is important to understand that these messages are not simply about appearance. They are about identity. They are about belonging. They are about whether a child's natural features align with the expectations of the group. When a child internalizes the belief that their eyes need to be altered, they are not only responding to beauty norms. They are responding to a hierarchy that has been culturally reinforced. The offer of surgery at 14 is significant. In many families, this procedure is treated as a rite of passage. It is presented as a practical step toward adulthood, academic success, or social acceptance. But for the child, the message is clear: your natural face requires correction. This creates what we call cultural dissonance. The child learns that the same people who love them also believe that their inherited features are insufficient. Hannah's avoidance of eye contact is not a superficial reaction. It is a behavioral adaptation to years of internalized scrutiny. When a child grows up believing that their eyes are the part of their face that needs fixing, they learn to hide. They learn to lower their gaze. They learn to manage how much of their face is visible to others. These behaviors often persist into adulthood. What Hannah described is not a personal insecurity. It is the result of a cultural system that has elevated one set of features while diminishing another. This system is maintained through repetition, silence, and the belief that altering one's appearance will lead to better opportunities. Families often believe they are helping, but the psychological impact is profound. To heal from this, individuals often need to reconstruct their sense of identity outside of the inherited hierarchy. They must learn to see their monolids as part of their lineage, not as a flaw. This process requires time, support, and the ability to name the cultural forces that shaped their early experiences. The cultural psychologist stepped back slightly, signaling that their analysis was complete.
Amina stood slowly, her posture careful and composed, as if she were preparing herself to speak a truth she had carried for years. She looked toward Dr. Blake, then toward the room, grounding herself before beginning. My name is Amina. I am Somali American, and my story is about my nose. Not in a light-hearted way. Not in a joking way. In my family, my nose became the feature everyone commented on. The feature everyone had an opinion about. The feature that was treated like a flaw. Growing up, I heard the same comments again and again. It is too big. You should get it done when you are older. You would be beautiful if your nose was smaller. These were not said with anger. They were said casually. They were said in front of relatives. They were said as if they were helpful. I learned very early that my nose was something to hide. I started covering my face in photos. I angled my head so the camera would not catch my profile. I learned to smile without lifting my chin. I learned to monitor myself before anyone else could comment. In my community, certain features are praised and others are criticized. Narrow noses are treated as delicate, refined, and beautiful. Wider noses are treated as something to correct, something to shrink, something that makes you less feminine, less desirable, less acceptable. I did not understand that these standards came from history. I only knew that my own family kept pointing out the part of my face that I could not change. I only knew that every comment made me feel smaller. I only knew that I started to dread being seen. I developed chronic anxiety around my appearance. Not because I wanted to be perfect, but because I wanted the comments to stop. I wanted to walk into a room without wondering who would notice my nose. I wanted to take a photo without feeling the need to hide. My family believed they were being honest. They believed they were preparing me for a world that judges women harshly. They believed they were helping. But the impact was that I learned to see my features as wrong. I learned to evaluate myself through a standard that was never mine. I want to be clear. I love my culture. I love my community. But there is a silence around feature shaming that affects many girls. It is treated as normal. It is treated as harmless. It is treated as something you should simply accept. But it shapes how you see yourself. It shapes how you move through the world. I am still learning to see my nose as part of my heritage, not as a flaw. I am still learning to take photos without hiding. I am still learning to look at myself without hearing those comments in my head. That is my story. Thank you for listening. Amina sat down with quiet composure, as if naming the truth had lifted a weight she had carried alone.
Dr. Blake stepped forward with a calm, steady presence, offering Amina a respectful nod before addressing the room. Thank you, Amina. What you described reflects a form of in-group feature shaming that is both common and deeply impactful. When a child's nose becomes the focus of repeated comments, evaluations, or suggestions for future surgery, the nervous system does not interpret those statements as neutral. It interprets them as information about belonging, safety, and worth. When a child hears comments such as, "It is too big," or, "You would be beautiful if your nose were smaller," the message is not about aesthetics. It is about identity. It is about whether the child's inherited features align with the standards of the group. And because these comments come from family, they carry significant emotional authority. In Amina's case, the teasing was framed as casual, even affectionate. But the nervous system does not differentiate between playful and serious when the content targets a core feature of the face. The child internalizes the message that something about them is fundamentally wrong. This creates what we call an identity injury. It affects how the child sees themselves long before they have the language to articulate what is happening. Amina described covering her face in photos. That is not vanity. That is a protective response. When a child learns that a specific feature is under scrutiny, they instinctively try to hide it. They adjust their posture. They avoid certain angles. They monitor themselves in social settings. These behaviors become automatic, and over time, they can develop into chronic anxiety. It is important to understand that these messages are often delivered with the belief that they are helpful. Families may think they are preparing the child for a world that judges women harshly. They may believe they are offering guidance. But intention does not erase impact. The nervous system processes the experience, not the rationale. Amina described learning to see her features as wrong. That reaction is consistent with what we see in individuals who grow up in environments where appearance is heavily policed. When a cultural standard is presented as universal, the child learns to evaluate themselves through that standard. They learn to see their natural features as deviations rather than expressions of heritage. What Amina described is not a superficial issue. It is a form of cultural conditioning that shapes self-perception, confidence, and the ability to feel at home in one's own face. These messages can persist well into adulthood, influencing social interactions, self-esteem, and emotional regulation. As we continue, I want everyone to understand that in-group feature shaming is powerful because it is delivered quietly, consistently, and with emotional authority. It becomes part of the environment. It becomes part of the child's internal narrative. And it takes time, awareness, and support to unlearn. He stepped back slightly, signaling the transition. Thank you again, Amina. We will now move to the next layer of analysis.
Tarquin stepped forward with a steady, grounded presence, acknowledging Amina with a quiet nod before turning to the room. His voice carried the calm clarity of someone who understands how repeated comments about a child's face can shape their entire sense of self. What Amina described is something many Somali American and East African girls experience, but rarely name out loud. When a child hears comments such as, "It is too big," or, "You would be beautiful if your nose were smaller," those words do not land as jokes. They land as judgments. They tell the child that the feature they inherited from their ancestors is a flaw. In many families, these comments are delivered casually. They are said during gatherings, during conversations, sometimes even with laughter. But for the child, the message is unmistakable. Your nose is the part of your face that needs correction. Your features do not match the standard. You are being measured, and you are falling short. When Amina talked about covering her face in photos, that is something many children learn to do without ever being taught. They angle their head. They hide behind their hand. They avoid side profiles. They learn to manage how much of their face is visible. These are not habits. They are survival strategies. In-group feature shaming is powerful because it targets something a child cannot change. A nose is not a hairstyle. It is not clothing. It is not a choice. It is part of the face the child wakes up with every day. When that feature becomes the focus of criticism, the child learns to associate their identity with inadequacy. Amina mentioned developing chronic anxiety around her appearance. That is not an overreaction. When a child grows up believing that their nose is the first thing people notice, they begin to anticipate judgment before it happens. They scan rooms. They avoid cameras. They monitor themselves constantly. This is not vanity. This is the emotional residue of being told that your features are wrong. In-group harm is difficult to name because it is delivered through the language of honesty. Families say they are being truthful. They say they are preparing the child for the world. They say they are helping. But the impact is that the child learns to evaluate themselves through a standard that was never theirs. They learn to see their heritage as something that needs correction. What Amina described is not a cosmetic issue. It is a story about identity. It is a story about belonging. It is a story about the emotional cost of being told that your natural features are unacceptable. And it is a story many carry quietly into adulthood, long after the comments stop. Tarquin stepped back, signaling that his translation was complete. The cultural psychologist steps forward. What Amina described reflects a form of feature-based in-group harm that is deeply rooted in many East African communities, including Somali communities. Nose shaming is not simply a matter of preference. It is tied to history, to colonial influence, to shifting beauty hierarchies, and to the internalization of external standards. In many East African cultures, certain facial features have been idealized while others have been criticized. Narrow noses have often been associated with refinement, femininity, and higher social status. Wider noses have been associated with African ancestry, which was devalued under colonial rule. These associations did not disappear. They were absorbed into cultural norms and passed down through families. When Amina's family told her that her nose was too big or that she would be beautiful if it were smaller, they were not inventing a new standard. They were repeating a message that has been normalized across generations. These comments are often delivered casually, even affectionately, but they carry significant psychological weight. They communicate that her inherited features are a deviation from the ideal. It is important to understand that these messages are not simply about appearance. They are about identity. They are about belonging. They are about whether a child's natural features align with the expectations of the group. When a child internalizes the belief that her nose is a flaw, she is not only responding to beauty norms. She is responding to a hierarchy that has been culturally reinforced. The teasing Amina described is particularly impactful because it targets a feature that cannot be changed without surgery. When a child is repeatedly told that her nose is too large, she learns to monitor herself. She learns to hide in photos. She learns to anticipate judgment. These behaviors are not superficial. They are adaptive responses to repeated scrutiny. Amina's chronic anxiety around her appearance is consistent with what we see in individuals who grow up in environments where facial features are heavily policed. When a cultural standard is presented as universal, the child learns to evaluate themselves through that standard. They learn to see their natural features as deviations rather than expressions of heritage. What Amina described is not a personal insecurity. It is the result of a cultural system that has elevated one set of features while diminishing another. This system is maintained through repetition, silence, and the belief that altering one's appearance will lead to better social outcomes. Families often believe they are being honest or helpful, but the psychological impact is profound. To heal from this, individuals often need to reconstruct their sense of identity outside of the inherited hierarchy. They must learn to see their features as part of their lineage, not as flaws. This process requires time, support, and the ability to name the cultural forces that shaped their early experiences. The cultural psychologist stepped back slightly, signaling that their analysis was complete.
The sociologist rose with a steady, deliberate posture, acknowledging Amina with a respectful nod before addressing the room. What Amina described is a clear example of in-group harm operating through feature policing. In Somali and broader East African communities, certain facial features are idealized while others are criticized. These preferences are not random. They are shaped by history, by colonial influence, by shifting beauty hierarchies, and by the internalization of external standards. In-group harm is powerful because it is delivered by the people who are supposed to provide safety. When a child hears that her nose is too big or that she would be beautiful if it were smaller, the message is not about aesthetics. It is about conformity. It is about aligning with a standard that the community has absorbed over generations. And because the message comes from family, it is absorbed without question. Feature shaming is sustained through three mechanisms that appear consistently across cultures. First, repetition. The same comments are delivered across generations. Second, silence. No one challenges the standard, so it becomes unquestioned truth. Third, social reward. Individuals who conform to the narrow nose ideal receive praise, validation, and perceived desirability. In Amina's case, the teasing was framed as casual, even affectionate. But sociologically, this is one of the most potent forms of in-group harm. When criticism is delivered with laughter or framed as honesty, it becomes harder to challenge. The child learns that the scrutiny is normal. The child learns that the standard is legitimate. The child learns that her features are a deviation. Feature-based in-group harm is particularly damaging because it targets something the child cannot change. A nose is not a choice. It is not a style. It is not a preference. It is an inherited feature. When that feature becomes the focus of criticism, the child internalizes the belief that their lineage is flawed. This is not simply body image. This is identity. Amina described covering her face in photos. That is a predictable outcome. When a child grows up believing that their nose is the first thing others notice, they begin to anticipate judgment before it happens. They hide. They monitor themselves. They adjust their posture. These behaviors are not superficial. They are adaptive responses to repeated scrutiny. It is important to understand that Amina's family was not acting in isolation. They were participating in a cultural script shaped by history and reinforced by community norms. Narrow noses have been idealized in many East African communities for decades, often linked to colonial hierarchies that positioned certain features as superior. These hierarchies become internalized and passed down, long after the external pressure has changed. In-group harm is difficult to dismantle because it is delivered through the language of honesty and care. Families believe they are preparing the child for a world that judges women harshly. They believe they are offering guidance. But the impact is that the child learns to evaluate themselves through a standard that was never theirs. They learn to see their inherited features as wrong. To heal from this, individuals and communities must learn to question the standards they inherited. They must separate cultural pride from cultural hierarchy. And they must create space for natural features to exist without correction, without apology, and without the weight of historical judgment. The sociologist stepped back, signaling that their analysis was complete. Rôvi stood slowly, her posture steady but guarded, as if she were preparing to speak a truth she had carried for most of her life. She looked toward Dr. Blake, then toward the room, grounding herself before beginning. My name is Rôvi. I am African American, and my story is about the harm that came from my own community. Not strangers. Not outsiders. The people who looked like me. The people who shared my history. The people who should have been my safety. Growing up, I heard the same comments again and again. You are too dark. Your lips are too big. Your nose is too wide. Your hair is too coarse. These were not said with anger. They were said casually. They were said in front of relatives. They were said as if they were simply stating facts. As a little girl, without my consent, the adults used toxic chemical relaxers or a hot iron comb because my curls were called nappy, or bad hair. I was told that straight hair was considered good hair and more acceptable. I begged the adults to allow me to take pride in my natural African hair, but they refused to listen to the voice of a child. Those chemicals ran down my neck and burned. They scarred my scalp. And now, my hair follicles are permanently damaged. My hair will not grow. I wear wigs or head coverings or I go bald. And even that becomes another reason for people to judge me. I was mocked for my natural features by children who looked just like me. Children who had the same ancestry. Children who had the same history. They laughed at my skin tone. They laughed at my lips. They laughed at my nose. They laughed at my hair. They physically bullied me. They cornered me. They hit me. They made me feel unsafe in my own community. To this day, I feel anxious around my own culture. Not because I do not love my people, but because my nervous system remembers the harm. It remembers the laughter. It remembers the comments. It remembers the physical attacks. It remembers being told that I did not fit the beauty standard. I was rejected because I did not have fake blonde extensions. I was rejected because I refused to get my nose trimmed down to look Western. I was rejected because my features were too African, too natural, too real, too much of what we were taught to be ashamed of. The rejection pushed me toward other cultures. I thought I would be safer there. But I was not. They discriminated against my hair, my lips, my nose, my skin. I learned that the same hierarchy existed everywhere. I learned that I did not fit anywhere. I learned to isolate myself. I learned to disappear. This trauma has caused me to not identify with being called African American. Not because I am ashamed of my heritage, but because the nervous system sees my heritage as a threat. My body remembers those traumas and reacts to a threat before my mind can access it. I am even triggered by certain cultural music. There is a silence around colorism, feature rejection, and hair policing that harms children. It is treated as normal. It is treated as harmless. It is treated as something you should simply accept. But it shapes how you see yourself. It shapes how you move through the world. It shapes your sense of safety. I am still learning to see my features as part of my heritage, not as flaws. I am still learning to exist without hiding. I am still learning to trust that I do not have to change my face to be worthy. She exhaled slowly. That is my story. Thank you for listening. Rôvi sat down with quiet composure, as if naming the truth had lifted a weight she had carried alone for far too long.
Dr. Blake stepped forward with a calm, steady presence, offering Rôvi a respectful nod before addressing the room. Thank you, Rôvi. What you shared is a clear and powerful example of cultural trauma. Cultural trauma develops when the environment that should provide safety instead becomes the source of repeated harm. The nervous system does not interpret these experiences as isolated incidents. It interprets them as patterns. It interprets them as danger. It interprets them as a loss of belonging. When a child repeatedly hears statements such as, "You are too dark," "Your lips are too big," "Your nose is too wide," or "Your hair is too coarse," the nervous system encodes those messages as information about identity. A child does not have the cognitive capacity to understand the historical origins of these standards. A child only knows that the people who share their features are telling them that those features are unacceptable. The forced use of chemical relaxers or a hot iron comb is not a cosmetic detail. It is a violation of bodily autonomy. When a child's hair is altered without consent, especially through painful or damaging methods, the nervous system experiences that as a threat. The burning, the scarring, the inability to protect oneself, these are traumatic imprints. The permanent follicle damage you described is not only physical, it is symbolic of the long-term impact of being told that your natural hair is unworthy. You described being mocked and physically bullied by children who looked like you. That is one of the most damaging forms of in-group harm. When harm comes from peers who share your ancestry, the nervous system learns that similarity does not guarantee safety. It learns that the group itself is unpredictable. It learns that belonging is conditional. This creates a rupture in cultural identity that can persist for decades. The anxiety you feel around your own culture is not a rejection of your heritage. It is a physiological response to repeated harm. The nervous system remembers patterns of danger. It remembers the laughter. It remembers the comments. It remembers the physical attacks. It remembers the moments when your features were treated as liabilities. This is why certain cultural cues, including music, can trigger a threat response before your mind has time to interpret what is happening. You described seeking safety in other cultures, only to encounter the same hierarchy in different forms. That is a predictable outcome. When Eurocentric standards dominate the broader society, the same rejection appears again. This creates isolation. It creates confusion. It creates a fractured sense of identity. The nervous system learns that there is no safe place, which is one of the core features of cultural trauma. What you described is not a matter of insecurity. It is the long-term impact of being told that your inherited features, your skin tone, your lips, your nose, your hair, are deviations from the standard. These messages shape how the nervous system interprets safety. They shape how you move through the world. They shape your ability to feel at home in your own body. As we continue, I want everyone to understand that colorism, feature rejection, and hair policing are not cultural traditions. They are inherited hierarchies. They are the residue of a system that ranked African features as inferior. And they continue to harm children because they are delivered quietly, consistently, and with emotional authority. He stepped back slightly, signaling the conclusion. Thank you again, Rôvi. Your story illustrates the depth of cultural trauma and the resilience required to name it.
Tarquin stepped forward with a grounded, steady presence, acknowledging Rôvi with a quiet nod before turning to the room. His voice carried the weight of someone who has seen how deeply in-group harm can shape a child's sense of self. What Rôvi described is something many African American children experience but rarely name. When a child hears comments such as, "You are too dark," "Your lips are too big," "Your nose is too wide," or, "Your hair is too coarse," those words do not land as observations. They land as judgments. They tell the child that the features they inherited from their ancestors are unacceptable. These comments are often delivered casually. They are said during hair care routines, during family gatherings, during childhood play. But for the child, the message is unmistakable. Your features do not match the standard. You are being measured, and you are falling short. When Rôvi talked about being forced to use chemical relaxers or a hot iron comb, that is something many children experience long before they understand what is happening. The burning, the pain, the smell of chemicals, these are not beauty rituals. They are lessons. Lessons that say your natural hair is wrong. Lessons that say your identity must be altered to be tolerated. Lessons that say your body does not belong to you. Being mocked by children who looked just like her is one of the most painful parts of her story. In-group harm is powerful because it comes from people who share your features. When those same people target you for those features, the child learns that there is no safe place. The child learns that belonging is conditional. The child learns that similarity does not protect you. Rôvi described being physically bullied. That is not teasing. That is enforcement. Children enforcing a hierarchy they did not create but learn to uphold. When a child is attacked for their features, the nervous system learns to associate the group with danger. That fear does not disappear with age. It becomes part of the body. When Rôvi said she feels anxious around her own culture, that is not rejection. That is survival. Her body remembers the harm before her mind can interpret it. Even cultural music can trigger that memory. That is what cultural trauma looks like. It is not symbolic. It is lived. It is carried in the body long after the environment has changed. When she said she was rejected for not having fake blonde extensions or for refusing to alter her nose, that is the clearest example of how deeply these hierarchies run. She was not rejected for behavior. She was rejected for her features, for her lineage, for the parts of herself she could not change. When she said she sought safety in other cultures and found the same hierarchy there, that is something many people experience. When Eurocentric standards dominate the broader society, the same rejection appears again. The child learns that there is no place where their features are fully accepted. That is how isolation forms. That is how disappearance becomes a survival strategy. When Rôvi said she struggles to identify with the term African American because her nervous system interprets her heritage as a threat, that is not a lack of pride. That is trauma. Her body learned to brace itself before her mind could form language. That is what happens when harm comes from the place that was supposed to be home. What Rôvi described is not a cosmetic issue. It is a story about identity. It is a story about belonging. It is a story about being told that your natural features are unacceptable in the very place where you should have been protected. And it is a story many carry quietly into adulthood, long after the comments stop. Tarquin stepped back, signaling that his translation was complete.
The cultural psychologist steps forward. What Rôvi described reflects a deeply rooted pattern within African American communities, one shaped by centuries of imposed hierarchy. Colorism, feature rejection, and hair policing did not originate within the community. They were inherited from a system that ranked African features as inferior and rewarded proximity to European standards. These hierarchies were absorbed, repeated, and normalized across generations. When Rôvi heard comments such as, "You are too dark," "Your lips are too big," "Your nose is too wide," or "Your hair is too coarse," she was not simply receiving opinions. She was receiving messages shaped by a historical structure. These messages were delivered casually, even affectionately, but they carried the weight of a hierarchy that predates her family by centuries. The forced use of chemical relaxers or a hot iron comb is not merely a grooming practice. It is a cultural ritual rooted in survival. For decades, straight hair was associated with professionalism, respectability, and social acceptance. But for a child, these practices communicate something far more personal, that their natural hair is unacceptable. That their identity must be altered to be tolerated. That their body is not theirs to protect. Rôvi begged to take pride in her natural hair, and her voice was dismissed. That dismissal is significant. It reflects a generational belief that conformity is protection. Adults often believe they are preparing the child for a world that judges harshly. But the impact is that the child learns to distrust her own instincts. She learns that her natural features are liabilities. The bullying Rôvi experienced from children who looked like her is a direct expression of internalized hierarchy. Children replicate what they see. They enforce the standards they have absorbed. They target the features that have been culturally devalued. This is not simply pure conflict. It is the community acting as an agent of the hierarchy. When Rôvi described feeling anxious around her own culture, that is a predictable psychological outcome. Cultural trauma occurs when the group that should provide belonging becomes the source of harm. The nervous system learns to associate cultural cues, including music, with danger. This is not a rejection of heritage. It is a conditioned response to repeated injury. Her difficulty identifying with the term African American is not a matter of shame. It is a matter of safety. Identity labels are not abstract. They are tied to lived experience. When the body associates the cultural group with threat, the label itself becomes charged. This is a physiological response, not a moral one. When Rôvi sought safety in other cultures and found the same hierarchy there, she encountered the global reach of Eurocentric beauty standards. These standards are not confined to one community. They shape media, institutions, and social interactions across cultures. This creates a sense of displacement, a sense of not belonging anywhere. What Rôvi described is not a story about appearance. It is a story about identity formation under pressure. It is a story about how cultural hierarchies become internalized and enforced. It is a story about the long-term impact of being told that your natural features are deviations from the ideal. And it is a story that illustrates how cultural trauma is carried in the body, in the nervous system, and in the sense of self. The cultural psychologist stepped back, signaling that their analysis was complete. The sociologist rose with a steady, deliberate posture, acknowledging Rôvi with a respectful nod before addressing the room. What Rôvi described is a clear and deeply patterned example of in-group harm operating through internalized hierarchy. In-group harm is most potent when it is delivered by the people who are supposed to provide safety. When a child is told that her skin tone, her lips, her nose, or her hair are unacceptable, the message is not about aesthetics. It is about conformity. It is about whether her inherited features align with the standards the community has absorbed. Their tone remained calm, analytical, and grounded in sociological evidence. Colorism, feature rejection, and hair policing within African American communities are not organic cultural practices. They are the result of a historical system that ranked African features as inferior. These hierarchies were enforced during enslavement, reinforced during segregation, and carried forward through media, institutions, and social norms. Over time, these standards became internalized. They became part of the cultural script. They continued with clarity. In-group harm is sustained through three mechanisms that appear consistently across generations. First, historical inheritance. The hierarchy is passed down without being questioned. Second, repetition. The same comments are delivered across decades until they feel like truth. Third, social reward. Individuals who conform to Eurocentric standards receive validation, desirability, and perceived refinement. They paused briefly, allowing the room to absorb the sociological weight of that structure. The forced use of chemical relaxers or a hot iron comb is not simply grooming. It is a form of enforced assimilation. It communicates that natural African features must be corrected. It communicates that the child's body must be altered to meet the standard. And when these practices cause permanent damage, as they did for Rôvi, the harm becomes both physical and symbolic. Their voice remained even, but the precision sharpened. The bullying Rôvi experienced from children who looked like her is a critical detail. In-group harm becomes most damaging when it is enforced horizontally. Children replicate the hierarchy they have absorbed. They target the features that have been culturally devalued. They enforce the standard without understanding its origins. This is how the community becomes the enforcer of a hierarchy that was never originally theirs. They shifted slightly, maintaining their composed presence. When Rôvi described feeling anxious around her own culture, that is a predictable sociological outcome. In-group harm creates what we call cultural threat conditioning. The child learns that the group that should provide belonging is also the group that delivers harm. The nervous system adapts by becoming hypervigilant in cultural spaces. This is not a rejection of heritage. It is a survival response to repeated injury. They continued with steady clarity. Her difficulty identifying with the term African American is not a matter of shame. It is a matter of safety. Identity labels are tied to lived experience. When the group associated with the label becomes a source of harm, the label itself becomes charged. The body responds before the mind can interpret. This is a sociological pattern seen in communities where internalized hierarchy has been enforced for generations. They looked toward Rôvi with respect, then addressed the room again. When Rôvi sought safety in other cultures and found the same hierarchy there, she encountered the global reach of Eurocentric beauty standards. These standards are not confined to one community. They shape media, institutions, and social interactions across cultures. This creates a sense of displacement, a sense of not belonging anywhere, a sense of being unprotected in every direction. Their tone softened, but their clarity remained firm. What Rôvi described is not a story about appearance. It is a story about how communities internalize and enforce the hierarchies imposed upon them. It is a story about how children learn to evaluate themselves through standards that were never theirs. It is a story about how cultural trauma becomes embedded in the body, in the nervous system, and in the sense of self. They stepped back slightly, signaling the conclusion. Rôvi's story illustrates the full cycle of in-group harm, inherited hierarchy, enforced conformity, internalized rejection, and long-term cultural trauma. Naming this cycle is the first step toward interrupting it. The sociologist stepped back, signaling that their analysis was complete.
The professor of African American, trauma-informed studies stepped forward with a calm, steady presence, acknowledging Rôvi with a respectful nod before addressing the room. What Rôvi described cannot be understood without examining the historical forces that shaped African American identity across generations. The comments she heard, "You are too dark, your lips are too big, your nose is too wide, your hair is too coarse," did not originate within her community. They are the echoes of a system that ranked African features at the bottom of a racial hierarchy designed during enslavement. During enslavement, African features were deliberately devalued. Skin tone, hair texture, and facial features were used to determine labor assignments, proximity to the enslaver's household, and perceived intelligence or worth. These distinctions were not accidental. They were engineered to divide the enslaved population and to create internal hierarchies that discouraged unity. After emancipation, these hierarchies did not disappear. They were reinforced through segregation, employment discrimination, media representation, and social norms. Lighter skin and straighter hair were associated with opportunity, safety, and social mobility. Darker skin and tightly coiled hair were associated with danger, exclusion, and limited access. These messages became embedded in the cultural fabric. When Rôvi was forced to use chemical relaxers or a hot iron comb as a child, she was not simply being groomed. She was being initiated into a generational survival strategy. Straight hair was historically linked to employment, respectability, and acceptance. But for a child, these practices communicate something far more personal, that her natural features are liabilities. That her body must be altered to be tolerated. That her heritage must be softened to be acceptable. The bullying Rôvi experienced from children who looked like her is a direct expression of internalized oppression. Children do not invent these hierarchies. They inherit them. They enforce them without understanding their origins. They replicate the very system that once harmed their ancestors. This is how generational trauma becomes self-perpetuating. When Rôvi described feeling anxious around her own culture, that is a predictable outcome of cultural betrayal. Cultural betrayal occurs when the group that should provide safety becomes the source of harm. The nervous system learns to associate cultural cues, including music, with danger. This is not a rejection of heritage. It is the physiological imprint of generational trauma. Her difficulty identifying with the term African American is not a matter of shame. It is a matter of survival. Identity labels are not neutral. They carry the weight of lived experience. When the body associates the cultural group with threat, the label itself becomes charged. This is a trauma response, not a cultural rejection. When Rôvi sought safety in other cultures and found the same hierarchy there, she encountered the global reach of Eurocentric beauty standards. These standards were exported through colonialism, media, and global power structures. They shape perceptions of beauty, professionalism, and desirability across cultures. This creates a sense of displacement, a feeling of being unprotected everywhere. What Rôvi described is not a personal failure. It is the lived expression of a historical system that devalued African features for centuries. Her story illustrates how generational trauma is transmitted, how internalized hierarchies are enforced, and how cultural wounds are carried in the body. These wounds did not start with her. They were inherited, learned, and passed down. Naming them is the first step toward breaking the cycle. The professor stepped back, signaling that their analysis was complete.
Amethyst moved to the front of the room with a gentle, steady presence, her voice soft but clear enough to settle the space. Before we transition into our lunch break, I want to make a few important announcements so everyone knows what support is available to you. She allowed the room to settle before continuing. First, we will be taking a full 1-hour lunch break. For all registered participants, the cafeteria meals are complimentary for this session. You are welcome to eat in the cafeteria, outside the building, or right here in the classroom. Choose the environment that helps your body feel grounded and supported. Her tone remained warm and organized. If anyone has forms that need to be signed, either Dr. Blake or Tarquin will be available during the break to assist you. If you have questions, you may email me directly or place your thoughts in the suggestion box. A facilitator will remain in the classroom at all times during the lunch break, so you are never without support. She gave the room a moment to breathe. When we return, we will finish hearing from our remaining guest speakers and then move into our questions and answers segment. She took a slow, grounding breath of her own. Before we dismiss for lunch, I would like to guide us through a grounding exercise. This will help your nervous system settle after the emotional depth of the stories we have heard today. Amethyst's voice softened, becoming almost rhythmic. Please find a comfortable position. You may sit with your feet flat on the floor, or rest your hands gently in your lap. There is no right or wrong way to be here. Simply allow your body to settle. She paused, letting the room adjust. Begin by noticing the sensation of the chair supporting you. Feel the weight of your body being held. You do not have to hold yourself up alone. A slow breath. Now, inhale gently through your nose. Let the breath fill your chest, then your ribs, then your belly. Exhale slowly through your mouth. Let the air leave your body at its own pace. Another pause. Allow your shoulders to soften. Allow your jaw to loosen. Allow your hands to rest without effort. Her tone remained steady, soothing. Bring your attention to the parts of your body that feel settled. Even if it is only one small area, the soles of your feet, the palms of your hands, the space between your shoulders, let that be enough. Let that be your anchor. She continued with calm precision. If any emotions are present, you do not need to push them away. You do not need to fix them. Simply notice them. Let them exist without judgment. Your body is allowed to respond to what it has heard today. A gentle breath. Take one more slow inhale. And one long, steady exhale. She allowed the silence to settle for a moment. When you are ready, you may slowly bring your awareness back to the room. Amethyst's voice returned to its warm, grounded tone. You are now dismissed for lunch. Take care of yourselves during this hour. Nourish your body. Rest your mind. And return when you feel ready. When Amethyst dismissed the room for lunch, the energy shifted immediately. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as participants stood, stretched, and drifted toward the cafeteria. Some carried lunch boxes they had brought from home. Others headed out to claim their complimentary meals. A few stayed behind to wash their hands or simply breathe in the quiet. Dr. Blake remained at the front of the room, sorting through a few papers. Tarquin stayed as well, leaning against a desk, available but not intrusive. Several participants approached them quietly, one asking Dr. Blake a private question, another handing Tarquin a form to sign. A couple of people slipped suggestions into the box near the door. Earl and Peggy stayed in their usual seats in the middle of the classroom, unpacking their lunches. Rôvi sat directly in front of them, still processing the emotional weight of her own story. She stood to go wash her hands, but before she could take a step, Peggy rose and crossed the small distance between them. Without hesitation, Peggy wrapped her arms around Rôvi in a full, warm, mama bear embrace. She held her tightly, not out of pity, but out of recognition. Tears streamed down Peggy's face, quiet but unstoppable. Earl stepped behind Peggy and gently patted her back, steadying her. When Peggy finally released the hug, she wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. Rôvi gave her a soft smile. "Thank you," Rôvi said. Peggy cupped Rôvi's cheek with her palm, her voice thick with emotion. "When I hear stories like yours, it makes me never want to complain ever again." Earl nodded firmly. "You are stronger than I thought you were, kid. Just when I think you have been through enough, I hear more. You are an amazing survivor. You are a survivor." Rôvi lifted her arms in a playful strong man pose. "That is right. I am a survivor." Her smile lightened the air around them. Earl chuckled. "Come on, let us go get lunch." The three of them walked toward the hallway. As they passed the back row, they saw Latham sitting beside Angel. Latham stood immediately, pride written all over him. "I would like you to meet Angel," he said. Earl, Peggy, and Rôvi approached. Angel greeted them with a warm smile. She did not extend her hand. She had already noticed that Rôvi did not shake hands, but she offered a respectful nod. Latham explained, "She reached out to me to let me know I have a son." Earl and Peggy's eyes widened, not in judgment, but in genuine happiness. They had always known Latham wanted to meet his children, but life had not been kind to him in those years. Latham pulled out his phone and began flipping through pictures. Earl and Peggy leaned in, delighted. "Oh my goodness," Rôvi said softly. "I am so happy for you." Peggy clasped her hands together. "Where is the little fellow?" Angel answered, "He is at the babysitter's. He is too young to sit through a long lecture like this. Maybe one day I will bring him, but I would have to leave early. He is just too young for this setting." Earl asked, "What is his name?" Latham's chest lifted with pride. "Latham Jr." Peggy and Earl let out a joyful cheer. "Oh, that is wonderful," Peggy said. "We are so happy for you." They chatted a moment longer, Peggy still trying, gently, to determine whether Angel and Latham were together. She offered a hopeful smile. "You two look like a family already." Angel and Latham simply smiled back. No clarification, no denial, just a quiet, shared moment. Before leaving, Peggy asked, "Is Rich here today?" Latham shook his head. "No, he was tired. He picked me up from the airport, then he had to pick up Karma, then he took me to Angel's house. He had a long day." Earl nodded. "How long are you in town?" "Just for the holidays." Latham straightened with pride. "Oh no, sir. I am out. I am out for the next 4 years in the reserves." Peggy looked at Earl. Isn't that just like Bonnie and Charles's son Robert? He is in the reserves too. That is right, Latham said. Earl asked, what are you going to do with yourself, son? Latham smiled. Rich helped me get a job where he works, as a mechanic. And he helped me get an apartment near him. I think I am going to be okay. I am going to spend time with my son. And reconnect with him. And with his mother. Angel looked up at him with a soft smile. Peggy, still curious but respectful, smiled at both of them. You two enjoy your lunch. You too, Latham said. The three of them headed toward the cafeteria. After lunch, about 30 minutes later, Amethyst returned to the classroom. Dr. Blake and Tarquin stepped out to take their own lunch break. Some specialists rotated out, others rotated in. Earl and Peggy returned to their seats with their trays. Rôvi returned as well, settling into her desk with her lunch. A few participants trickled back early, choosing the quiet of the classroom over the cafeteria. After a full hour, the room felt refreshed. People were fed, calmer, and ready to continue. Latham was still scrolling through pictures of his son, unable to stop smiling. The atmosphere was lighter now, grounded, steady, and prepared for the next phase of the seminar.
Dr. Blake stepped to the front of the room, giving a gentle tap on the podium to gather everyone's attention as participants settled back into their seats with the last sips of water and the final rustle of lunch wrappers. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you were able to rest, nourish yourselves, and take a moment to breathe. We are now ready to continue with our next speaker. Our next participant is Priya. She will be sharing her lived experience with skin tone hierarchy and the cultural obsession with fairness that shaped her childhood. Her story reflects the pressures placed on many children within South Asian communities, where shade becomes a measure of worth, opportunity, and belonging. He stepped aside with a respectful nod. Priya, the floor is yours. Priya walked to the front with a quiet, composed posture. She took a breath, grounding herself before she began. My name is Priya. I am Indian American, and my story is about the hierarchy of skin tone that shaped my childhood. In my family, fairness was not just a preference. It was a standard, a rule, a measure of value. She looked down briefly, then lifted her gaze again. Growing up, I was constantly compared to my lighter cousins. I heard the same comments over and over. You are too dark. Use this cream. Fair girls get better opportunities. These were not said with anger. They were said casually. They were said as if they were simply stating facts. When I was 9 years old, my family gave me bleaching creams. They told me it would help. They told me it would make me more beautiful. They told me it would give me a better future. I was 9. I did not understand chemicals or consequences. I only understood that my shade was a problem. I grew up believing I was less worthy. I grew up believing that lighter skin meant better treatment, better chances, better love. My culture taught me that my worth depended on my shade. That the closer I was to fairness, the more acceptable I became. I am still unlearning those messages. I am still learning that my skin tone is not a flaw. I am still learning that I do not have to lighten myself to be worthy. That is my story. Thank you for listening. Priya stepped back, her composure intact, but her truth now shared with the room.
Dr. Blake stepped forward again. Thank you, Priya. What you shared reflects a form of cultural trauma that is often minimized because it is delivered through everyday language, family routines, and what is framed as guidance. But the nervous system does not distinguish between harm delivered gently and harm delivered harshly. It responds to the message, not the tone. When a child repeatedly hears statements such as, "You are too dark," or "Use this cream," or "Fair girls get better opportunities," the nervous system interprets these messages as conditions for belonging. A child learns that acceptance is not unconditional. It is contingent on shade. The child learns that their natural skin tone is a barrier to opportunity, affection, and approval. The introduction of bleaching creams at age 9 is particularly significant. At that developmental stage, children are forming their core beliefs about identity and worth. They do not understand chemicals. They do not understand long-term consequences. They only understand that the adults around them believe their natural skin tone is a problem that must be corrected. This creates a rupture in self-perception. The child begins to monitor their shade the way others monitor behavior. Skin tone hierarchy functions as a form of internalized oppression. It teaches children to evaluate themselves through a lens that was never theirs to begin with. It teaches them that lighter skin is associated with safety, desirability, and opportunity, while darker skin is associated with limitation. These messages become embedded in the nervous system long before the child has the language to challenge them. When you said you grew up believing you were less worthy, that belief did not originate within you. It was taught, it was reinforced, it was repeated until it felt like truth. That is how cultural trauma operates. It does not require violence. It requires consistency. The idea that your worth depends on your shade is not a personal insecurity. It is the result of a hierarchy that has existed in South Asian communities for generations. These hierarchies are tied to colonial history, caste structures, and global beauty standards. They are systemic, they are inherited, and they are often delivered by people who believe they are helping. The work you are doing now, unlearning those messages, reclaiming your skin tone, redefining your worth, is not simple. It requires confronting years of conditioning. It requires challenging beliefs that were presented to you as facts. And it requires rebuilding a sense of self that was shaped by comparison. As we continue, I want everyone to understand that skin tone hierarchy is not a cultural preference. It is a form of inherited trauma. It shapes identity. It shapes opportunity. It shapes belonging. And it begins in childhood, often with the people who believe they are protecting the child's future. Thank you again, Priya. Your story illustrates the psychological impact of shade-based valuation and the resilience required to reclaim your identity from it.
Tarquin stepped forward again. Tarquin nodded gently toward Priya before turning to the room. What Priya shared is the kind of harm that hides in plain sight. It does not arrive through shouting or punishment. It arrives through comparisons, through comments said casually, through routines that are framed as care. And because of that, it becomes even more powerful. A child does not question what is repeated with confidence. When a child hears, "You are too dark," or "Use this cream," or "Fair girls get better opportunities," those words do not land as suggestions. They land as rules. They tell the child that her natural shade is a disadvantage. They tell her that her future depends on changing something she cannot control. They tell her that her worth is conditional. When Priya said she was given bleaching creams at age 9, that detail matters. At 9 years old, a child is still forming their understanding of themselves. They do not know what bleaching is. They do not know what chemicals do. They only know that the adults around them believe their skin tone needs correction. That is not grooming. That is identity training. That moment teaches the child, your natural skin is not acceptable. It teaches her that lighter skin is the path to approval. It teaches her that darker skin is a barrier she must overcome. And because these messages come from family, they feel like truth. When Priya said she grew up believing she was less worthy, that belief did not come from insecurity. It came from repetition. It came from watching lighter cousins praised. It came from hearing fairness treated as a form of currency. It came from being told that opportunities belong to those with lighter skin. Her culture taught her that her worth depended on her shade. That is not an exaggeration. That is the lived reality for many South Asian children. Shade becomes a ranking system. Shade becomes a predictor of how others will treat you. Shade becomes a measure of desirability, opportunity, and belonging. When she said she is still unlearning those messages, that is the part many people overlook. These beliefs do not disappear when you grow up. They stay in the body. They stay in the mirror. They stay in the silence between compliments. They stay in the way you compare yourself without meaning to. What Priya described is not a cosmetic issue. It is a story about identity. It is a story about being taught that your natural shade limits your future. It is a story about being told that lighter skin is the path to acceptance. And it is a story many carry quietly into adulthood, long after the creams are gone. Tarquin stepped back, signaling that his translation was complete.
The cultural psychologist stepped forward. What Priya described is not simply a family preference or a cultural quirk. It is the lived expression of a hierarchy that has existed for centuries across South Asian societies. Skin tone valuation is not accidental. It is the product of layered historical forces, caste structures, colonial rule, and global beauty standards, all of which position fairness as the ideal and darker skin as a disadvantage. When Priya heard comments such as, "You are too dark, use this cream," or, "Fair girls get better opportunities," she was not receiving isolated remarks. She was receiving messages shaped by a long lineage of social conditioning. These messages were delivered casually, even affectionately, but they carried the weight of a hierarchy that predates her by generations. The introduction of bleaching creams at age 9 is a critical detail. In many South Asian households, these products are framed as self-care or preparation for the future. But for a child, they communicate something far more personal: that her natural shade is a problem. That her body must be altered to be acceptable. That her worth is conditional. Priya grew up believing she was less worthy because she was taught to measure herself against a standard she could never meet. This is how internalized hierarchy forms. It begins with comparison, it continues through repetition, and it becomes embedded in the child's sense of self long before she has the language to question it. Shade-based valuation is not simply about beauty. It is about belonging. It is about opportunity. It is about how a community interprets worth. When a child learns that lighter skin is associated with better treatment, better chances, and better love, the message becomes part of her identity. It shapes how she sees herself in every environment. When Priya said she is still unlearning those messages, that is entirely expected. Cultural trauma does not disappear with age. It remains in the nervous system. It remains in the mirror. It remains in the silence between compliments. It remains in the instinct to compare oneself to others. What Priya described is not a cosmetic issue. It is a story about how cultural hierarchies become internalized. It is a story about how children learn to evaluate themselves through standards that were never theirs. And it is a story about the long-term impact of being told that your worth depends on your shade. The cultural psychologist stepped back, signaling that their analysis was complete.
The sociologist stepped forward. What Priya described is a clear example of in-group harm operating through internalized hierarchy. In-group harm is most potent when it is delivered by the people who are supposed to provide safety. When a child hears comments such as, "You are too dark," or, "Use this cream," or, "Fair girls get better opportunities," those messages do not feel like opinions. They feel like rules. They feel like cultural law. Their voice remained even, but the clarity sharpened. Skin tone hierarchy in South Asian communities is not an isolated phenomenon. It is the result of layered historical forces: caste stratification, colonial rule, and global beauty standards that elevated fairness as the ideal. Over generations, these external hierarchies became internalized. They became part of the cultural script. They became part of what families believed would protect their children. They continued with steady precision. In-group harm is sustained through three mechanisms that appear consistently across communities. First, historical inheritance. The hierarchy is passed down without being questioned. Second, repetition. The same comments are delivered across decades until they feel like truth. Third, social reward. Individuals with lighter skin receive validation, desirability, and perceived opportunity. They allowed the room a moment to absorb the structure behind the harm. When Priya was given bleaching creams at age 9, that was not simply a cosmetic suggestion. It was an initiation into a hierarchy. It was a message that her natural shade was a liability. It was a lesson that her body needed correction to be acceptable. And because this message came from family, it carried the weight of authority. The comparisons to lighter cousins are a classic form of horizontal enforcement. Children learn the hierarchy by watching who is praised and who is corrected. They learn that fairness is treated as a form of currency. They learn that darker skin is treated as a disadvantage. And they internalize these lessons long before they have the language to challenge them. When Priya said she grew up believing she was less worthy, that belief did not originate within her. It was taught. It was reinforced. It was repeated until it became part of her identity. That is how in-group harm works. It does not require hostility. It requires consistency. When she said her culture taught her that her worth depended on her shade, that is not an exaggeration. That is the lived reality for many South Asian children. Shade becomes a ranking system. Shade becomes a predictor of opportunity. Shade becomes a measure of belonging. The long-term impact of this kind of harm is not limited to childhood. It shapes adult identity. It shapes self-perception. It shapes relationships. It shapes how a person interprets their place in the world. And because the harm came from within the community, it becomes difficult to name without feeling disloyal. What Priya described is not a cosmetic issue. It is a story about inherited hierarchy. It is a story about how communities internalize the standards imposed upon them. It is a story about how children learn to evaluate themselves through a lens that was never theirs. And it is a story about the long-term cultural trauma that forms when worth is tied to shade. The sociologist stepped back, signaling that their analysis was complete.
Dr. Blake stepped forward again. Thank you, everyone. We will now continue with our next participant. He glanced toward the front row where Luca sat, offering him a small, encouraging nod. Our next speaker is Luca. He will be sharing his experience with body hair shaming within his own family. His story reflects a pattern seen in many communities where natural male features are mocked, minimized, or treated as flaws. These messages often begin in childhood and can shape body image, intimacy, and self-worth well into adulthood. He stepped aside, giving Luca the space. Luca, the floor is yours. Luca walked to the front with a hesitant but determined posture. He took a breath, grounding himself before he began. My name is Luca. I am Italian-American, and my story is about body hair. Not something people usually talk about seriously, but it shaped a lot of my life. In my family, body hair was a joke. A constant joke. I heard it from the time I was a kid. You look like a bear. Shave that. It is embarrassing. Girls will not like you like that. These comments were said at family gatherings, holidays, even in front of other relatives. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because I did not know what else to do. But when you hear those comments over and over, you start to believe them. I started to think something was wrong with me. I started shaving everything. I started hiding. I stopped taking my shirt off at the pool. I stopped letting people get close to me. I developed body dysmorphia. I did not have the language for it at the time, but I knew I hated what I saw in the mirror. I avoided intimacy because I was afraid someone would see me and think the same things my family said. My culture taught me that my natural body was unattractive. That being hairy was something to be ashamed of. That I had to change myself to be acceptable. I am still trying to unlearn that. I am still trying to see myself without hearing their voices. He nodded once, signaling he was finished. Thank you for listening.
Dr. Blake stepped forward again. Thank you, Luca. What you described reflects a form of in-group harm that is often dismissed because it is delivered through humor. But humor can be one of the most powerful delivery systems for shame. When a child or adolescent becomes the target of repeated jokes about their body, the nervous system does not interpret those comments as playful. It interprets them as evaluations, as corrections, as warnings. When you heard comments like, "You look like a bear, shave that, it is embarrassing," or, "Girls will not like you like that," those were not neutral statements. They were messages about acceptability. They were messages about desirability. They were messages about what your family believed your body needed to be in order to be worthy of approval. Body hair is a natural genetic trait. But when a family repeatedly frames it as a flaw, the child internalizes the idea that their body is wrong. That their body must be altered. That their body is a source of embarrassment. This is how body dysmorphia forms. Not from a single comment, but from a pattern of messages that teach the child to monitor, critique, and correct their appearance. The fact that these comments came from relatives is significant. In-group harm carries more weight because it comes from people who are supposed to provide safety. When the people closest to you mock your body, the nervous system interprets that as a threat to belonging. And belonging is a core developmental need. When you said you avoided intimacy, that is a predictable outcome. Body dysmorphia often leads to avoidance behaviors, avoiding mirrors, avoiding vulnerability, avoiding situations where the body might be seen. The fear is not irrational. It is learned. It is the result of years of hearing that your natural body is unacceptable. Your culture taught you that your natural body was unattractive. That is not an exaggeration. Many Mediterranean and Latin cultures have a complicated relationship with body hair, simultaneously normalizing it in men while also mocking it. This creates a double bind. You are told it is natural, but you are also told it is undesirable. That contradiction becomes internalized. The work you are doing now, unlearning those messages, challenging the internalized shame, rebuilding a relationship with your own body, is not simple. It requires confronting years of conditioning. It requires separating your identity from the comments you absorbed. And it requires learning to see your body without the filter of ridicule. As we continue, I want everyone to understand that body hair shaming is not harmless teasing. It is a form of body-based conditioning. It shapes self-image. It shapes intimacy. It shapes how a person interprets their own desirability. And it begins in childhood, often with the people who believe they are being playful. Thank you again, Luca. Your story illustrates the psychological impact of repeated body-based mockery and the resilience required to reclaim your sense of self from it.
Tarquin stepped forward. Tarquin nodded toward Luca, acknowledging the courage it takes for a man to speak about body shame in a room like this. What Luca described is the kind of harm people rarely take seriously because it comes disguised as jokes. But jokes can shape a child's entire relationship with their body. When the people who are supposed to protect you turn your body into entertainment, you learn very quickly that your body is not yours. It is something for others to comment on, laugh at, correct. When a boy hears, "You look like a bear," or, "Shave that, it is embarrassing," or, "Girls will not like you like that," those words do not land as teasing. They land as warnings. They tell him that his natural body is unacceptable. They tell him that he must change himself to be desirable. They tell him that his worth depends on altering something he did not choose. And because these comments come from relatives, uncles, cousins, grandparents, they feel like truth. Family humor has a way of becoming the script you carry into adulthood. You start shaving not because you want to, but because you are afraid of being seen. You start hiding your body because you assume everyone else will react the way your family did. When Lucas said he developed body dysmorphia, that makes perfect sense. Body dysmorphia often begins with repeated micro-criticisms. Not one big moment, 1,000 small ones. 1,000 reminders that your body is wrong. 1,000 laughs at your expense. Over time, you stop seeing your body as neutral. You see it as a problem to solve. And when he said he avoids intimacy, that is not weakness. That is conditioning. If the people who raised you made you feel ashamed of your body, why would you trust someone else to see it without judgment? Avoidance becomes protection. Distance becomes safety. His culture taught him that his natural body was unattractive. And that message sticks. It stays in the mirror. It stays in the shower. It stays in the dressing room. It stays in the moment someone reaches for you and you flinch because you are sure they will see what your family mocked. What Luca described is not about hair. It is about identity. It is about being taught that your body is a punchline. It is about learning to shrink yourself because the people around you made your body feel too big, too visible, too wrong. And it is about the long, slow work of trying to see yourself without hearing their voices. Tarquin stepped back, signaling that his translation was complete.
The cultural psychologist stepped forward. What Luca described is a form of cultural conditioning that is often minimized because it is delivered through humor. But humor is one of the most efficient ways cultures transmit norms. When a community uses jokes to police bodies, those jokes become lessons. They become rules. They become identity-shaping messages. In many Mediterranean and Latin communities, body hair is both common and stigmatized. This creates a contradictory cultural script. The trait is natural, but it is also treated as undesirable. Children absorb contradictions more deeply than adults. When the body is simultaneously normalized and mocked, the child learns a single message: your natural body is wrong. When relatives say, "You look like a bear, shave that," it is embarrassing. Or, "Girls will not like you like that," they are not simply making jokes. They are reinforcing a hierarchy of desirability. They are teaching the child that certain bodies are more socially valuable than others. And because these messages come from family, they carry the weight of cultural authority. Body hair shaming functions as a form of in-group regulation. It is how communities enforce appearance norms without explicitly naming them. The teasing is framed as harmless, but its function is corrective. It tells the child what is acceptable. It tells him what must be hidden. It tells him what will be judged. When Luca said he developed body dysmorphia, that is entirely consistent with the psychological impact of repeated body-based commentary. Body dysmorphia often emerges when a child is taught to scrutinize a natural trait as if it were a flaw. Over time, the internalized gaze becomes stronger than any external one. The child begins to see himself through the eyes of the critic. When he said he avoids intimacy, that reflects another cultural layer. In many communities, masculinity is tied to desirability. Boys are told to be confident, but they are also told that their bodies must meet certain standards to be worthy of affection. This creates a double bind. Be confident, but only if you look the way we expect. Intimacy becomes threatening because it exposes the body to judgment. What Luca described is not about hair. It is about cultural messages that shape identity. It is about how communities use humor to enforce norms. It is about how children learn to evaluate themselves through standards they did not choose. And it is about the long-term impact of being told that your natural body is unattractive. The cultural psychologist stepped back, signaling that their analysis was complete.
The sociologist stepped forward. What Luca described as a clear example of in-group harm delivered through humor, one of the most socially accepted and socially defended forms of harm. When a community uses jokes to regulate bodies, those jokes become a disciplinary tool. They teach the child what is acceptable, what is shameful, and what must be corrected. In many Mediterranean and Latin communities, body hair is both common and stigmatized. This contradiction creates a cultural double bind. The trait is natural, but it is also treated as undesirable. This is not accidental. It is a form of internalized aesthetic hierarchy that has been passed down through generations. In-group harm is sustained through three mechanisms that appear consistently across cultures. First, historical inheritance. Communities inherit beauty norms from earlier generations, norms shaped by media, migration, assimilation pressures, and gender expectations. These norms become tradition, not preference. Second, repetition. The same jokes are repeated at gatherings, holidays, and family events. Over time, repetition transforms mockery into truth. The child internalizes the message long before they can analyze it. Third, social reward. Family members who conform to the preferred aesthetic, in this case, less body hair, receive praise, approval, and desirability. Those who do not conform become the target of humor. This reinforces the hierarchy without anyone needing to enforce it intentionally. They paused, allowing the room to absorb the structure behind the harm. When relatives say, "You look like a bear, shave that," it is embarrassing, or, "Girls will not like you like that," they are not simply teasing. They are enforcing a cultural standard of desirability. They are teaching the child that his natural body violates the norm. And because these messages come from family, they carry the weight of authority. The fact that Luca developed body dysmorphia is not surprising. Body dysmorphia often emerges when a child is taught to scrutinize a natural trait as if it were a defect. The internalized gaze becomes stronger than any external one. The child begins to monitor, correct, and hide the trait in an attempt to regain belonging. When Luca said he avoids intimacy, that reflects another sociological layer. In many cultures, masculinity is tied to desirability. Boys are told that their worth is measured by how attractive they are to potential partners. So when a family tells a boy that, "Girls will not like you like that," they are not just mocking his body. They are threatening his future social value. His culture taught him that his natural body was unattractive. That is not an exaggeration. It is the predictable outcome of a system in which humor is used to enforce conformity. In-group harm becomes invisible because it is normalized. It becomes difficult to name because it is framed as affection. And it becomes difficult to challenge because it is tied to belonging. The long-term impact of this kind of harm is not limited to adolescence. It shapes adult identity. It shapes intimacy. It shapes how a person interprets their own desirability. And because the harm came from within the community, it becomes entangled with loyalty, culture, and family identity. What Luca described is not about hair. It is about inherited norms. It is about how communities police bodies through humor. It is about how children learn to evaluate themselves through standards they did not choose. And it is about the long-term cultural trauma that forms when worth is tied to conformity. The sociologist stepped back, signaling that their analysis was complete.
May stepped forward with a quiet, careful posture, the kind of posture shaped by years of trying to make herself appear taller without drawing attention to the effort. She took a breath before speaking. My name is May. I am Chinese American, and my story is about height. Or more specifically, about being told that my height was a problem. I grew up hearing the same comments over and over. You are too short. No one will take you seriously. You need to wear heels always. My family said these things casually, like they were giving me helpful advice. But it never felt like advice. It felt like a warning. They compared me to my taller cousins constantly. At family dinners, at holidays, at weddings. Look at her, she looks so elegant. Look at him, he has presence. And then they would look at me. And I knew what they were thinking before they said it. I started to stand differently. I started stretching my neck, lifting my chin, pulling my shoulders back. I developed chronic posture anxiety. I was always trying to look taller, even when no one was watching. I still do it without thinking. My culture taught me that my body was inadequate, that my height made me less credible, less attractive, less worthy of respect. I learned to measure myself against a standard I could never reach. I am still trying to unlearn that. I am still trying to stand the way my body naturally wants to stand. Thank you for listening.
Dr. Blake stepped forward. Thank you, May. What you described reflects a form of in-group harm that is often overlooked because it is framed as guidance. But guidance can be a delivery system for shame. When a child repeatedly hears comments such as, "You are too short," "No one will take you seriously," or, "You need to wear heels always," the nervous system does not interpret those statements as suggestions. It interprets them as evaluations, as corrections, as conditions for acceptance. Height is a fixed trait. When a family treats a fixed trait as a flaw, the child internalizes a sense of inadequacy that feels permanent. The message becomes, "There is something wrong with you that you cannot change." That is a powerful foundation for chronic anxiety. The comparisons to taller cousins are not incidental. Comparison is one of the most potent forms of in-group regulation. Children learn the hierarchy by watching who is praised and who is corrected. When taller relatives are described as elegant, impressive, or commanding, and you are described as lacking, the nervous system encodes that hierarchy as truth. When you said you developed chronic posture anxiety, that is a predictable outcome. Height cannot be changed, so the body tries to compensate in the only way it can: posture. Lifting the chin, stretching the neck, pulling the shoulders back, these are not aesthetic choices. They are survival strategies. They are attempts to meet a standard that was never attainable. Posture anxiety is a form of hypervigilance. It is the body's attempt to prevent further criticism. It is the nervous system saying, "If I can just look a little taller, maybe I will be safe." Over time, this becomes automatic. It becomes part of how you inhabit your body. When you said your culture taught you that your body was inadequate, that is not an exaggeration. That is the psychological impact of repeated height-based messaging. Height becomes tied to credibility. Height becomes tied to respect. Height becomes tied to social value. And when a child learns that she does not meet that standard, she internalizes inadequacy as identity. What May described is not about height. It is about the long-term impact of being told that your natural body is insufficient. It is about how in-group harm becomes normalized when it is framed as advice. And it is about the resilience required to unlearn messages that were delivered as truth. Thank you again, May. Your story illustrates how deeply cultural expectations can shape posture, self-perception, and the way a person moves through the world.
Tarquin stepped forward. What May described as the kind of harm that hides inside comments people think are helpful. When a girl grows up hearing, "You are too short," or, "No one will take you seriously," those words do not land as advice. They land as a judgment about her value. They tell her that her body is a disadvantage she must constantly compensate for. When her family tells her to wear heels all the time, the message underneath is that her natural height is not acceptable. That she has to modify herself to be taken seriously. That she has to earn credibility by altering her appearance. Those messages become part of her identity long before she understands what they are doing to her. The comparisons to taller cousins are not harmless. They teach her the hierarchy. They teach her who is praised and who is corrected. They teach her that height equals elegance, authority, and respect, and that she does not have it. Over time, she stops seeing height as a trait and starts seeing it as a flaw. Chronic posture anxiety makes perfect sense in that context. When you cannot change your height, you try to change the only thing you can, the way you hold your body. You stretch your neck, lift your chin, pull your shoulders back, not because you want to, but because you are trying to escape criticism. It becomes automatic. It becomes part of how you move through the world. When May says her culture taught her that her body was inadequate, she is naming the core wound. She learned that her height affects how seriously people take her. She learned that her credibility is conditional. She learned that her body needs correction before it is acceptable. What she described is not about height. It is about being taught that her natural body is a liability. It is about carrying the belief that she must constantly compensate for something she cannot change. And it is about the long process of trying to stand in her own body without feeling like she is failing a standard she never chose. Amethyst steps forward. Before we close, I want to bring everyone back into their bodies. We have covered experiences that were personal, cultural, and deeply internalized. Grounding is how we prevent those stories from settling in the nervous system as tension. Begin by noticing the weight of your body. Not correcting it. Not adjusting it. Just noticing it. Feel your feet supported by the floor. Feel the chair supporting you. Let your spine be exactly where it is without trying to lengthen it or hold it upright. Take a slow breath in. Not a perfect breath. Just a real one. Let the exhale fall out naturally. Bring your attention to the parts of your body that feel neutral. Not good, not bad, simply present. It might be your hands. It might be your legs. It might be the space around your shoulders. Let that neutral place be your anchor. If any tension rises, you do not need to fix it. You only need to acknowledge it. The body responds to acknowledgement more than correction. Take one more slow breath. Let the room feel a little wider. Let your body feel a little less managed. You are here. You are safe. And you do not have to hold anything perfectly. Amethyst steps back. Dr. Blake steps forward. Thank you, Amethyst. We have reached the end of this seminar. What we explored today required honesty, cultural awareness, and emotional endurance. Each story revealed how deeply in-group messages shape identity, posture, self-perception, and the way a person moves through the world. You named experiences that were minimized for years. You examined the cultural structures behind them. And you allowed yourselves to understand the psychological impact without self-blame. The work you did today matters. The seminar is now formally closed. Take time to rest. Take time to integrate. And take time to let your body return to itself.